Chapter 240. The signboard of the restaurant was made of some unknown metal, and it was shining under the sun. The wooden door was made of the best mahogany, and it had a classic and exquisite handle. What was even more amazing was the transparent crystal on one side. Although there was something white inside that blocked one's view, one could still imagine how big the transparent crystal was cut from. What kind of craftsmanship was required to cut it so evenly and flawlessly? This crystal is probably worth thousands of dragon coins, right? DeVoe asked hesitantly with his eyebrows raised. Boss, this restaurant seems to be closed for the day. It's not open, Johnny said as he took a few steps forward and glanced at the notice on the door. Did the owner of this restaurant owe a lot of money and run away with the waiters? Why are there so many blades piled up at the door? Gabriel asked as he walked forward with his saber. He glanced at the mountain of blades in front of the door with a hint of mockery and ridicule. Boss, what should we do? Gabriel asked as he turned around and looked at DeVoe. He tapped his finger gently on the hilt of his saber, and a strand of long red hair fell from his forehead. It made his pale face with a long scar look a little sinister. As a third-tier knight who had failed to pass the exam, his strength had reached the standard of a third-tier knight. However, the examiner was a little ignorant, and said that he had no humility and compassion, and could not be a qualified knight. Humility and compassion are things that only the weak have. Why would a brave knight need such things? Gabriel recalled what the examiner had said, and still remembered his answer. Then, he naturally became a knight who had failed to pass the exam, and became the most ruthless watcher of DeVoe's tavern. Indeed, he had no compassion. He was paid to do things for others, and that was his only standard. As for what he was doing, he never cared. Screw it up. Since he's not around, we have to teach him a lesson. There are some people that he can't afford to offend. There are some words that he has to pay the price for. DeVoe's smile was a little cold as he waved his hand. That. Smash it too. Gabriel's gaze turned to the floor-to-ceiling glass at the side. He licked his lips, and his eyes suddenly became a little excited. Such a huge crystal, he would never be able to own it in his life. But if he could destroy it, it seemed to be more exciting than owning it. Just smash the door. DeVoe's voice rose a few octaves. The crystal was too expensive, and it would be troublesome if the Grey Temple found out about it. A door would be fine, and he could just smash it and get away with it. Could it be that the owner of a small restaurant dared to make a big fuss over a door? DeVoe coughed softly and regained his composure. He raised his hand and said, "Go ahead." "All right." Gabriel withdrew her gaze in disappointment and resumed her lazy expression. She unsheathed the sword at her waist and slashed at the door of the restaurant without any fancy moves. A third-level knight's sword was enough to cut down a thick tree or a wooden door. There was no need to use a second sword. "How dare you try to set me on fire? Then I'll smash your store to smithereens. Let's see if you can still sell tofu pudding." Goudinia's expression was a little excited. It wasn't that he hadn't thought about it before, but he lacked the courage to do so. Today, after being provoked by Ward, a wave of ruthlessness surged up. He naturally didn't dare to commit murder in Chaos City, nor did he dare to commit arson. However, he was used to smashing a store and threatening someone to get back at them. The Grey Temple ensured the safety of all the shops, but they couldn't guarantee absolute order. They had been in the Aiden Square for decades, and no one knew better than them how to take advantage of these loopholes. Furthermore, according to their past experience, the shops that were bullied would only swallow their anger. After all, there were many things that were impossible to guard against when doing business in the Aiden Square. If they were caught, they wouldn't be able to survive. Bam! A dull thump erupted, but the door didn't break. Instead, the long sword in Gabriel's hand was repelled, and she stumbled back a step as she stared at the completely unscathed wooden door with incredulity in her eyes. How? How is this possible? Walter, who was standing beside the carriage, also glared and said with some dissatisfaction, "Gabriel, you spent all your fucking strength on women's bellies, right? If you can't even break a wooden door, then what's the point of keeping you around?" "This door." A hint of surprise also appeared on Johnny's face. He had been standing off to the side, and was naturally aware that even though Gabriel hadn't used his full strength, he had still used 70% or 80% of his strength. Even a door wrapped in iron would have been sliced in half, let alone an ordinary wooden door. However, there wasn't even a mark left on the door. It was as if the sword had struck nothing but air. If a magic barrier had been set up around the door, then it would have been understandable. However, he hadn't sensed any magic fluctuations at all. This was simply far too bizarre. Damn it. Gabriel's expression immediately became ferocious. He couldn't accept having his strength questioned. Even though he didn't know what was wrong with this door, he wanted to slice through anything that stood in his way. He gripped his long sword with both hands, and charged forward viciously before bringing it down on the wooden door. When the first muffled sound rang out, Meg looked in the direction of the door in confusion. The restaurant had been soundproofed by the system, and the sound from the outside was almost completely isolated. Even if they were having a heated argument outside, almost no sound could be heard from inside the restaurant. Such a muffled sound indicated that someone was attacking the restaurant's door. Someone seems to be knocking on the door. Is it a guest? Yarbemia also looked in the direction of the door in confusion. It's a knocking sound, not a knocking sound. Sally shook her head slightly, and her gaze became a little wary. If it was a knocking sound, then it meant that the visitor wasn't friendly. Ding. System learning completed. Ding. System notification. An enemy is attacking the restaurant's door. The LV1 restaurant's automatic defense system has been activated. It can defend against any type of attack below level 3. Ding. Host, please deal with the enemy as soon as possible. The defense system can defend against 3 attacks for free. From the 4th time onwards, each attack will be charged a gold coin as a reward. At this moment, the system's notifications rang out continuously. Even though the tone was high, it seemed to be a little tired. System, how's the learning progress? Meg's expression suddenly became a little strange as he asked in his mind. After the system's serious learning, I've completely grasped all the techniques, the system replied seriously. System, didn't you say that the restaurant didn't have any defense system? Why is it suddenly able to defend against attacks below level 3? Meg asked the question in his mind. Chapter 241. That's why you have to work hard to upgrade the restaurant. The restaurant will become your foundation and guarantee in this world. The system's voice was filled with temptation and enthusiasm. Bam! An even louder collision sound came from the direction of the door. Father, is someone here to cause trouble? Amy, who was immersed in the delicious braised chicken, also turned toward the door with a puzzled expression. Who's the enemy? Meg wasn't excited by the system's words. Instead, he raised an eyebrow at the door. Goodnia, the system replied. A cold expression appeared on Mag's face upon hearing that name. He asked, System, do you have a spare door? If you want, I can order one for 20 gold coins, the system replied quickly this time. Very good, your business has come knocking. Meg gently placed his chopsticks on the table with a smile, and said, remove the defenses. Are you sure you want to do this? The restaurant's property could be damaged. The system was a little perplexed. If I recall correctly, according to the rules set by the Grey Temple, residents of Chaos City can retaliate in self-defense when their lives or property are threatened. All consequences will be borne by the invaders. Meg's smile was a little cold as he calmly said, furthermore, whoever damages the restaurant has to pay. Isn't that the restaurant's rule? Rather than doing it yourself, the system suggests that you upgrade as soon as possible so that you can enjoy the high-quality service of sitting comfortably in the restaurant and waving away invaders, the system suggested earnestly. I don't have money. Meg didn't hesitate in the slightest. He turned toward the door with a smile, and said, yes, someone's here to cause trouble. This time, Amy's fireball won't hold back against anyone who dares to damage the restaurant. Yes. If anyone dares to damage the restaurant, Amy definitely won't let them off the hook. Amy nodded earnestly. Then, she glanced at the bowl of rice in front of her, and unhappily said, also, they're so annoying. Why do they have to cause trouble when we're eating? Father's braised chicken is so delicious, it's so annoying if I can't continue eating. Do you need my help? Sally also put down her chopsticks. She wasn't happy to be interrupted in the middle of tasting the food, but her good upbringing prevented her from showing any impatience on her face. She looked at Meg and asked softly, "No need." Before Meg could say anything, Amy raised her little hand and looked at Sally with a serious expression. "Big sister Aisha, let's leave this matter to Amy. I want them to know that Amy can be really fierce when she's angry." "All right." Sally looked at Amy's sincere expression, hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. Anyway, she could just watch from the side. If Amy couldn't handle it, she could just step in. As for Meg, Sally felt that he was a genius chef who could cook the most delicious food in the world. However, if he could even injure himself while fighting a bronze-skinned wild boar, and in the end, he probably had to rely on Amy to barely defeat it, which meant that he was wise not to waste time on cultivation. Perhaps his combat prowess wasn't very strong. Meg didn't stop them. Instead, he looked at the door and waited for them to break in. This level of attack was still far inferior to that of the bronze-skinned wild boar outside Stranglethorn Vale in the morning. Since they couldn't break through the defenses, it meant that the intruders weren't above level 3. Meg didn't believe that they could be more resistant than the bronze-skinned wild boar. At the door, Gabriel took 3 steps back with his knife in hand. He missed a step on the stairs, and only then did he not fall down. His expression was very dark. His second slash landed on the door, but it still didn't leave a single mark. The terrifying force of the rebound from the door made his hands feel a little numb. "He can't even cut open the door?" Gudnia looked at this scene with shock, and his expression was also a little ugly. He glanced at Gabriel, and it seemed that DeVoe's bragging about how he could even cut down his subordinates when he went crazy wasn't as powerful as he claimed. "Gabriel! You!" DeVoe yelled in annoyance. He had come today to stand up for Gudnia and show off his subordinates' prowess, but he didn't expect that they couldn't even cut open a wooden door. This was a complete loss of face for him. "Shut up." Gabriel turned around and gave DeVoe a cold look. His eyes were a little bloodshot. DeVoe's words were suddenly stuck in his throat. Looking at Gabriel's red eyes, he didn't dare to continue. He knew better than anyone how ruthless Gabriel was. He wasn't just making up stories about him cutting down his subordinates when he went crazy. If he really went crazy, he might even cut him down. "Johnny, you'll sell it with me. This door is a little strange, but it should be enough with you." Gabriel licked his pale lips and clenched the long sword in his hands. He stared at the wooden door, and without waiting for Johnny's reply, he stepped onto the stairs again. Holding the sword with both hands, he slammed it down on the wooden door. Johnny hesitated for a moment before raising the black wand in his hand. He chanted a string of spells, and a red flame lit up at the tip of the wand. It turned into a fireball that flew toward the wooden door. It crashed into the wooden door at almost the same time as Gabriel's sword. Bam! The sound of the fireball exploding and the long sword striking the wooden door coincided perfectly, and the scene of the wooden door being cut open didn't occur. The impenetrable wooden door was now like an ordinary wooden door, and it was torn into shreds by the terrifying power of the longsword and the exploding fireball. "It's open." Expressions of elation appeared on Gudinia's and DeVoe's faces at the same time. They had come here in high spirits to exact revenge, but they didn't think that they'd be stopped by a wooden door. Now that it was open, they were elated. A hint of confusion appeared on Gabriel's and Johnny's faces, but Gabriel still strode through the door with his longsword in hand. Johnny was half a step behind, but he also followed suit. Gabriel swatted away a small piece of wood that had fallen onto his shoulder. His crimson eyes narrowed slightly as he peered into the restaurant through the wood shavings that had yet to dissipate. He had thought that there would be no one in the restaurant, but there was a half-elf little girl with 2 ponytails standing in the middle of the aisle. She didn't even appear to be as tall as the table next to her, and she was currently glaring at them with her hands on her hips. There was also a man and 2 women sitting at the innermost table. There was a plate of food on the table, and it appeared that they were in the middle of a meal. "Someone's here?" Johnny's gaze also fell upon Meg and the others. When his gaze fell upon Sally, he immediately stopped, and a scorching look appeared in his eyes. He couldn't believe that there was such a beautiful woman in this world. Even if she was an elf, he was going to try and woo her. So there's someone inside. Why didn't you open the door when you heard the noise? A man and 3 women. Are you trying to be a coward? Gabriel tapped his long sword lightly on the ground as his gaze wandered unscrupulously between Yarbemia and Sally. The smile on his pale face was a little frightening. Chapter 242. Amy's words were a little childish, but there was a serious attitude in them. She raised her 2 small hands, and 2 bluish-purple flames suddenly rose. 2 streams of white gas were burned out of the air, and then suddenly collapsed into 2 fist-sized fireballs. Hearing the conversation, Gudnia was a little surprised. There's someone in the restaurant. It's good that there's someone here. Don't worry, Gabriel is the most experienced in dealing with this kind of thing. In a while, I'll make them kneel and kowtow to you to apologize. DeVoe waved his hand dismissively, and his expression became a little excited. Bullying the weak was really an interesting thing. Every time he did it, he would feel an inexplicable sense of excitement. Oh, little brat, do you think you can scare me away with such a small flame? Although I used to be a knight, I, Gabriel, have never had the bullshit principle of not hitting children. If you piss me off, I'll beat you up too. Gabriel looked at the fireballs in Amy's hands with some disdain. She looked at Meg, who was still sitting at the table, and said somewhat mockingly, "You're the owner of this restaurant, aren't you? I heard that you beat up my boss's friend. I'm here to avenge him. Are you going to take this little bastard out on your knees, or do you want me to do it?" This fireball? Johnny looked at the small fireballs in Amy's hands, but his eyes slowly widened, and he subconsciously took a step back. Meg looked at Gabriel's scarlet eyes, and his expression was still indifferent, but his hand was already holding a chopstick. "Red-eyed rabbit, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm going to hit you." Amy looked at Gabriel and shook her head seriously. Then, she threw the 2 small fireballs in her hands at the same time and shouted, "Go!" Small fireballs. The 2 small fireballs, only the size of a child's fist, flew toward Gabriel and Johnny. They didn't look fast, but in the blink of an eye, they were in front of the 2 of them. "Ha!" Gabriel laughed somewhat mockingly. She casually raised the long sword in her hand and gently patted it down. This level of fireball was not even a spark. How could a 4-year-old kid know magic? It was just a flame that could be easily extinguished. Ungrateful brats, she would make them suffer. Be careful. Johnny's expression changed drastically. Light flashed from his body, and a red magic barrier appeared. He waved his wand as if he wanted to release some kind of spell, and at the same time, he had already retreated toward the door. However, it was already too late. Bang bang. 2 explosions sounded almost at the same time. As soon as Gabriel's sword touched the fireball exploded. The 100 refined long sword instantly broke, and the terrifying blast of flames blasted him out of the restaurant. He landed on the street outside with a thud. His body was charred black, and he was lying on the ground with horrifying wounds all over his body. White foam came out of his mouth, and his scarlet eyes were filled with unwillingness as he looked in the direction of the restaurant's entrance. At the same time, the other fireball also exploded in front of Johnny. The magic barrier around his body barely held on for a while before it completely disappeared. He didn't even get a chance to chant the spell that he wanted to release. His black wand was reduced to smithereens by the heat wave, and he was also sent flying. He only had time to cast 2 water balls and a frost spell on himself at the last moment. He rolled a few times on the ground in a disheveled state before he knelt down and threw up a mouthful of blood. He supported himself with one hand on the ground, and was already unable to stand up. Many of the tables and chairs in the restaurant had also been flipped over by the terrifying blast of flames. However, the tables, chairs, floor, and walls were miraculously undamaged. It was just that the surface of the restaurant was a mess. So awesome. Yarbemia's mouth gaped open as she looked on with astonishment. She's only 4 years old, but the power of her instantaneous fireball magic is already close to that of a 4th-tier magic caster. Sally was also looking at Amy with astonishment on her face. She suddenly understood why the 2 great magic casters were fighting to take Amy as their disciple. There was probably no other magic caster with such terrifying aptitude on the Norland continent. Gabrielle. Johnny. N.I. DeVoe's face immediately paled at the sight of the two people flying out of the restaurant. These were the most powerful swordsman and magic caster in his tavern. What had just happened in the restaurant? What was the cause of that terrifying explosion? But no matter what, he knew that they had kicked an iron plate this time. This new restaurant was most likely not as simple as it seemed. DeVoe, let's get out of here right now. That father and daughter are lawless. Goodinia's expression also changed drastically as he patted DeVoe on the shoulder before climbing into his carriage. Chimph, it's you again. Don't run, bad guy. Have a taste of my little fireball. Amy made her way to the entrance of the restaurant and glared at Goodnia as he climbed into his carriage. She waved a hand through the air, and a little fireball flew toward the carriage. Be careful. That fireball is extremely powerful, Johnny yelled with all his might. The coachman immediately jumped out of the carriage and rolled into the nearby bushes. DeVoe and Goodnia stared at the fireball with wide eyes, and their thoughts and actions seemed to have been frozen. The fireball passed between the two of them before exploding inside the carriage. Boom! Flames rose into the air, and Goodnia and DeVoe, who were standing beside the carriage, were both sent flying. Their clothes were completely destroyed, and they were covered in burns and wounds from the explosion. They lay on the ground and looked at Amy, who was standing in front of Amy's restaurant, with expressions of horror on their faces. Then, they fainted one after another, and it was unknown whether they were dead or alive. Remember, I, Amy, am super fierce. Be good and don't come here to cause trouble in the future. You're really annoying for disturbing my meal. Amy looked at the four people who had collapsed in front of her restaurant and said seriously, little bastard. Gabrielle raised her head to look at Amy, and her fingers slowly reached for the broken sword that had fallen to the side. There was a hint of madness in her crimson eyes. Clatter. One of Mag's shoes stepped on the broken sword. He had no idea when Mag had come out. Meg looked at Amy and said with a smile, Amy, let's go in and eat first. Okay. Amy nodded happily and turned to enter the restaurant. A guy who only dares to hide behind a woman. Gabrielle raised her head and looked at Meg with a deranged expression. You don't deserve the title of a knight. Humility, integrity, compassion, bravery, justice, sacrifice, honor, and soul. You don't have any of the 8 virtues of a knight. Meg didn't become angry because of Gabrielle's words. Instead, he became calmer and looked at her with a hint of mockery and pity. He slowly leaned over and whispered in her ear, you should respect a true knight. I stand behind her, but I have the courage and determination to die for her. I am Meg Alex. Of course, only a dead man can hear this. Chapter 243. Murder. The woman's scream pierced the quiet air, and a commotion suddenly came from outside. Cries of surprise rose and fell one after another. The carriage was still burning, and the 4 people lying on the ground outside the restaurant were bleeding profusely, creating a rather gruesome sight. Isn't that Mammis? What happened? Did someone really die? I think there was a conflict in the restaurant. Looks like Boss is fine, but who died? Boss is fine? It's good that Boss is fine. If something happens to Boss and he can't cook, I'm going to kill those troublemakers. Isn't that Goodnia and DeVoe, those 2 bastards? I told you they'd get their retribution sooner or later. God is right. They came to cause trouble and were beaten to death. They died for nothing. These fellows kicked an iron plate. The 2 consecutive explosions had attracted everyone's attention. They looked at the 4 people lying in pools of blood outside the restaurant, and began to discuss spiritedly among themselves. Some were curious, some were elated, and some were lamenting. This was an alternate world, after all. Even though human life was precious in Chaos City, there were still people dying in the city every day. This was something that even the Grey Temple couldn't completely control, but it wasn't to the extent that everyone was screaming like a sissy. Of course, the Grey Temple naturally wouldn't stand by and do nothing. In Chaos City, the death of a person was always a big deal. A short and hurried whistle sounded, and a few people wearing the Grey Temple's uniform quickly gathered in the direction of Mammy Restaurant. They all wore grave expressions. Meg walked into the restaurant, and his expression was still as calm as ever. However, he was gripping his chopsticks so tightly that his knuckles were slightly pale. Perhaps it was because Meg Alex had killed too many people in the past, so when the chopsticks were plunged into Meg's throat, he wasn't too affected by the fact that it was his first time killing someone. Naturally, even he was a little surprised. If possible, Meg didn't want to kill anyone. Chaos City was still a very peaceful city. If he killed someone, he would be targeted easily. Given his current situation, it wasn't suitable for him to be too high profile. However, the way Gabriel looked at Amy made Meg want to kill him. This was a mad dog with nothing to lose. As long as he was still alive, he could bite anyone at any time. Therefore, he had to die, and he had to die cleanly. It was a good thing for the restaurant to show its claws and teeth. Otherwise, it would be too annoying if all kinds of kittens and puppies came to make trouble. As for Goodnia, DeVoe, and the other two, they could only be regarded as domestic dogs. After being beaten twice, they knew the taste of pain and didn't dare to make any noise. The higher a person stood, the more wealth he accumulated, the more afraid he would be of losing it, and the more he cherished his life. There was no need to worry too much about such a person. As for killing them all, Meg wasn't stupid enough to do that. The Grey Temple had spent 100 years to maintain order in Chaos City, and its core was to strictly abide by the law. Killing Gabriel, who clearly had a dirty hand, could be said to be self-defense, but if he killed Goodnia and DeVoe, who were waiting outside, he would most likely have to live in the Bastille prison. Of course, no matter who wanted to kill Amy, they had to die. Just like what he had said to Gabriel, even though he was standing behind Amy, he was always ready to die for her, and he definitely wouldn't allow anyone to hurt her before he fell. Are you all right? Yarbemia's face paled slightly upon hearing the cries outside. Murder was a serious crime in Chaos City, and regardless of whether it was Amy or Meg who had done it, it would be very difficult for the restaurant to continue operating. Meg might even be arrested. Sally was also looking at Meg with a complex expression. Even though Meg's body blocked her view, what had killed Gabriel was the chopstick that had pierced through his neck, while there was only one chopstick left beside Meg's bowl. Let's continue eating. We still have to clean up the restaurant later. Meg nodded and sat down again. He looked at Amy, who was immersed in the delicious braised chicken, and a gratified smile appeared on his face. As expected, watching Amy eat was the most healing thing. Oh! Yarbemia looked at the smile on Meg's face, and immediately felt a lot more at ease. He hesitated momentarily before sitting down again. Sally glanced at the door before picking up her chopsticks and continuing to eat. Father, this braised chicken is really delicious. Can we continue to eat braised chicken tonight? Amy asked expectantly as she ate. If you like it, of course. Meg nodded with a smile. He put a few pieces of chicken in his bowl into Amy's bowl, and patted Amy's head. Father is the best, Amy said happily as she rubbed her head against Meg's hand. The atmosphere in the restaurant relaxed because of Amy's smile. Amy still didn't know what was going on outside, and Meg wasn't going to let her know, either. Captain, it seems to be that restaurant again this time. Which idiot dares to come here and cause trouble? A thin young man beside Basil ran toward Amy's with a strange expression. Check the injured and see if they're dead. Don't be in a hurry to arrest them. Inform the Metropolitan Police Department to come over and assess the situation first before making a decision. Basil's expression was a little ugly. He glanced at Julian, who had pulled out a deck chair and was playing with the two birds hanging by the door. He added, Monkey, you go and inform Sir Brandley about this. Yes, sir. The young man called Monkey answered and ran toward the two people lying beside the carriage. He put his finger under Goodinia's and DeVoe's nostrils, and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Although they were weak, they were still alive. Their bodies were covered with burns and wounds caused by the explosion. It looked a little scary, but as long as they weren't dead, it was just an ordinary first-class incident. Monkey, a third-class incident. Report. Basil stood beside Gabriel's body and frowned when he saw the chopstick sticking out of Gabriel's neck. The thing he didn't want to happen the most had happened. Yes, sir. Monkey's expression changed, and he quickly ran over. A third-class incident meant that not only did someone die, but it was also not an ordinary person. "Captain." 5 people from the Metropolitan Police Department rushed over and looked at the scene, waiting for Basil's orders. "Keep an eye on him. Bob, treat the injured first. The rest of you, follow me." Basil pointed at Johnny, but his sharp eyes were fixed on Meg, who was eating in the restaurant. He walked toward the restaurant. Chapter 244. Mag put down his bowl of rice and smiled at Amy as he said, "Amy, if you're done eating, take Ugly Duckling upstairs to play for a while. Take it upstairs for dinner tonight. That little plate in the room outside is its food for tonight. Did Father prepare it for me?" Amy's eyes lit up. "Yes." Meg nodded. "Okay." Amy nodded happily before licking her empty braised chicken casserole bowl. She then picked up Ugly Duckling from the counter and carried it upstairs as she said, "Ugly Duckling, it looks like you won't be able to eat the super delicious braised chicken for lunch today. Let's go see what Father has prepared for you." Meg followed Amy to the corner of the counter, then looked up at Basil. He stood up and nodded. "You're here. You should know why we're here." Basil's sharp gaze was like that of an eagle's as he stared into Mag's eyes. For a person to be able to eat so calmly after killing someone without showing any fear, there was only one possibility: he had killed many people. Basil had been a member of the Grey Temple for 20 years, and had caught many murderers with his own hands. However, none of them could be as calm as Meg. There was no fear, nor was there any perverted excitement. He was so calm that it was as if he had just done something insignificant. Mag glanced at the silver embroidery of the word patrol on Basil's chest. The patrol team that patrolled the Aden Square arrived first, and they looked into Basil's eyes without any intention of avoiding his gaze. He nodded and said, "This happened in my restaurant, so I'll cooperate with the Grey Temple's investigation." As the governing body of Chaos City, the Grey Temple had the patrol department, the garrison department, and the city inspector department. They were responsible for daily security, food, city defense, and punishment. Their uniforms were similar to those of the Imperial Secret Service. They were grey robes, black pants, and no fancy flying fish. There were only 4 magic balls with comet-like tails on their backs that formed a ring. That was the symbol of the Grey Temple. The words embroidered on their chests indicated which department they belonged to. They wore black leather boots, and had standard long swords at their waists. The magic casters wore grey robes, and there was no requirement for wands. Basil nodded and looked at Mag with a serious expression as he said, "The victim was a knight, so this incident has been upgraded to a 3rd Tier 1. I hope you can tell us the truth about what happened. Everything you say will be recorded, and it will be used as an addendum." As you can see, the restaurant was closed for the day. My employees and my daughter and I were eating in the locked restaurant. In the middle of the meal, someone smashed the restaurant's door with a sword and a magic caster. A sword-wielding criminal and a magic caster rushed into the restaurant, and while they were smashing the restaurant, they threatened my safety. My daughter, Amy, cast 2 magic fireballs in self-defense, and knocked them out of the restaurant. Then, she discovered that the 2 criminal leaders were trying to use the carriage to attack the restaurant. In a moment of fear, she also threw a fireball at them. Meg pointed at the door, and nodded. That's what happened. Murder is not a small matter in Chaos City. Basil's eyes narrowed slightly upon hearing this. Mag's explanation was very concise, but he was able to explain the entire situation in a very clear and organized manner. In just a few simple sentences, he was able to shift the blame from him to that little girl. He didn't comment on the power of the fireball, but the fatal injury of the guy who died at the door was not caused by the fireball. Meg didn't mention that chopstick at all. That kind of excuse wouldn't get through. What's the big deal about killing a person? A hoarse voice sounded from outside the door. Big deal. That's nothing. A despicable voice yelled out smugly. How dare you? Who? An inspector shouted with a stern face. He turned around and saw Julian standing at the door with a birdcage. His expression changed, and he swallowed the rest of his words. Basil had repeatedly warned him not to provoke this hunchback. Who's the big deal? Charcoal poked his head out of the birdcage and glared at the inspector provocatively. I. The inspector looked at the featherless black crow, and was so angry that he gripped the long sword at his waist. However, he didn't dare to pull it out when he thought of the frost dragon dancing in the sky. Good that I know it's you. Charcoal retracted his head with satisfaction. Murder is a big deal in Chaos City. This is the rule of the Grey Temple, Basil said seriously. Beza turned to Urian with a serious expression. He was only a 5th-tier knight, but he had no intention of backing down. The rules of the Grey Temple were unquestionable in Chaos City. You can let Roland say that to me. I'm an old man, and I hate rules the most in my life. If you want to bind me with rules, I'll be interested in destroying them. Julian's smile became more and more cruel, and the air seemed to become colder all of a sudden. Basil's expression changed slightly, but he had already gripped the long sword at his waist. He wasn't afraid of sacrifice and death in order to protect the Grey Temple and the honor of the knights. The Lord asked me to send his regards to you, Master Julian. He said that he'd like to have a cup of tea with you after he's done with the Grey Temple. Right at this moment, Brandley's panting voice sounded, and he quickly walked in between Basil and Julian. He looked at Julian with a smile, and waved his hand behind his back, indicating for Basil to step back. You're going to be very busy this year, aren't you? Julian said with a mocking smile. There are indeed a lot of things to do in the Grey Temple recently, but no matter how busy I am, I'm sure it'll be over soon. What brings you here? A drop of sweat slid down Brandley's cheek, and his smile was a little forced. What the hell was going on? He was already an old man, and he had to deal with this every day. He had thought that he would come to the Aiden Square for a meal with Julian since he didn't have anything to do today, but who would have thought that something would happen to Amy's? Thankfully, he had arrived just in time. Julian's temper was notoriously unpredictable, and if he were to suddenly fly into a rage, a single spell would be enough to kill everyone here. Oh, it's nothing. I just heard that someone was trying to kill my dear disciple, so I came to see who it was. If he's still alive, I'll give him the final blow. Julian shook his head with a cold smile, and his voice was so cold that it could freeze one's bones. Basil and the others all took a step back reflexively, and their expressions changed slightly. They suddenly had a feeling that if it had been Julian who had attacked Amy, the 4 people outside would have all been dead by now. Little Amy is such a prodigy, so it's only natural that someone would try to kill her. Brandley suddenly understood why Julian was so angry. Monkey had just told him that someone had died at Amy's, and it turned out that the boss's daughter had something to do with it. Chapter 245. Brandley's expression immediately fell upon hearing that voice. Julian was already giving him a headache, and now Crassus was here as well. After taking in the same disciple, the Lord of Ice and Lord of Fire would most likely not be able to face off against each other in the near future. However, if they were to side with one another, then no one would be able to withstand it. Brandley turned to Crassus with a smile, and said, Master Crassus, little Amy is completely fine. We still can't determine whether that person intended to kill her or not. According to the Grey Temple's procedures, we have to first understand the case, then verify the truth based on the testimonies of both parties. That's the only way to resolve this issue. As someone who had grown up listening to the legends of the 2 great magic casters, Brandley's aura naturally paled in comparison. However, as a deacon of the Grey Temple, he definitely couldn't allow anyone to interfere with the investigation of a 3rd-tier case, even if the other party was a 10th-tier magic caster. Law was the foundation of Chaos City, and the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle were both very resolute in that regard. No matter who the culprit was, they had the courage and determination to fight back. You guys continue, I'll keep an eye on things. However, it doesn't matter whose testimonies it is, I only believe what Amy says. Crassus entered the room, and took a glance at Julian. This time, he didn't display too much hostility. Amy is right, Julian chimed in a raspy voice. It was rare for him to agree with Julian. Our Grey Temple will handle this matter impartially. Brandley's smile was a little forced. He was already cursing Gabriel to death many times in his heart. How dare he come to Amy's to cause trouble, and even try to attack Amy? Did he have a death wish? Beza, tell us the situation first, Brandley said to Beza. Beza was a little uncomfortable with the pressure that Crassus and Julian were exerting on him, but the two of them were powerful enough that even the Lord of the Grey Temple would have to treat them with respect. Thus, he recounted the situation that Meg had told him. Brandley's expression didn't look too good after hearing Beza's description. The people outside really didn't know what they were doing, but what was their motive? Was the truth really like what Meg said? He was not in a hurry to come to a conclusion. He turned to look at Meg and asked, "Mr. Mac, do you have anything else to add? If not, we'll question the others next." "Teacher Crassus, Teacher Julian." Meg greeted Crassus and Julian with a nod. He was very grateful for their unconditional support. This matter could be big or small, but it could be resolved as long as the Grey Temple didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Of course, even if they weren't present, Meg wasn't panicked. He shook his head and said, "That's what happened. I have nothing to add." However, according to the 18th law of Chaos City, which was jointly promulgated by the City Lord's Castle and the Grey Temple, residents are allowed to retaliate in self-defense when their lives or property are threatened. At the same time, my private property was invaded when the restaurant was closed. According to the 23rd law of Chaos City, I can expel the invaders through any means, and I won't be held responsible. A swordsman and a sorcerer forcefully broke the door that was locked from the inside and entered the restaurant with their swords. For a restaurant with only one chef, 2 waitresses, and a little girl, wouldn't that constitute an invasion and fatal threat? Meg paused momentarily, and looked at Brandley with a serious expression as he asked, "Am I right to say that?" The restaurant instantly fell silent. Basil and the other patrol officers were all looking at Meg in a different light. They had thought that Meg was going to push all the blame onto Amy, and then invite Crassus and Julian here to use them to pressure the Grey Temple. However, they didn't think that after the arrival of Crassus and Julian, Meg would stop emphasizing that Amy was the culprit. Instead, he brought up 2 laws of Chaos City that corresponded to this incident. Once these 2 laws were established, there was no point in arguing over who was the culprit. Just as Meg had said, he could expel the invaders through any means. This was a right granted to all residents by the Grey Temple and the City Lord's Castle. Meticulous thinking, straight to the point, that was the first thought that came to the minds of the patrol officers as they looked at Meg. If he were a criminal, then he would definitely be a difficult one to deal with. However, the situation was the exact opposite. He wasn't a criminal. Instead, he was a good citizen who had picked up the sword of Chaos City's laws and rebelled against the invaders. Be kind to the weak, fight against violence bravely, and never hurt any woman. These were all vows that he had made when he became a knight. The man who had broken into the restaurant with a sword and tried to attack a defenseless little girl clearly didn't deserve to be called a knight. He could only be considered a scum. Judging from the fragments of the wooden door, it was struck by a sharp sword and a bursting flame spell at the same time. Both were full-power 3rd-tier attacks. If he just wanted to enter the restaurant, he wouldn't have needed to use such a powerful attack. The broken sword was unsheathed, and the scabbard wasn't damaged. "This means that he entered the restaurant with his sword drawn," Beza said. He looked at Meg with a hint of admiration in his eyes. Being as calm as water after killing someone was not only a murderous act, but also when someone was determined to die. This was because he had already disregarded his own life. If Meg was trying to protect his daughter, Beza felt that this was very likely to be the case based on how much he doted on his daughter. Although he was only a chef, Beza still admired his bravery and fearlessness. After all, even a true knight wouldn't necessarily be able to do this. "Yes, you're right," Brandley nodded. He couldn't help but raise his voice a few octaves. This was the truth. This was great. The situation he was most worried about was that Meg would kill someone for no reason, and Crassus and Julian would insist on protecting him. If that happened, both sides would be in a stalemate, and the situation would very likely get out of hand. However, things were different now. No matter what their goal was, a 3rd-tier knight and a 3rd-tier magic caster had broken into the restaurant with all their might. This was already considered trespassing and threatening the safety of the residents. All of Meg and Amy's actions met the criteria of self-defense. Therefore, they were innocent. Everyone present had an answer in their hearts. Grey. Grey Temple. They're trying to kill us. You have to help us. Help. They're going to kill us. That little girl is going to kill us. She's going to burn us to death. Chapter 246. The restaurant suddenly became quiet. Hearing the complaints of Gudnia and Devoe outside, anger began to accumulate on everyone's faces. This was probably the so-called the guilty party cries out the victim first. How dare these two try to twist the truth at a time like this? Do they think our Grey Temple is a pushover? Brandley was fuming with rage as he strode out of the restaurant. Basil and the others also followed along with thunderous expressions. A third-tier swordsman and a third-tier magic caster had attacked a shop in the Aiden Square in broad daylight. This was a blatant disregard for the authority of the Grey Temple, as well as the inspection office. Mr. Mac, was this really done by Amy? Crassus wasn't in a hurry to leave. Instead, he turned to Meg and asked in a quiet voice. If you're talking about a fireball, then it was indeed done by Amy. Weren't you the one who taught her how to use an exploding fireball? Meg turned to Crassus with a peculiar look on his face. Amy had gone to class the day before, and this morning, she had used an exploding fireball against the bronze wild boar. Meg had thought that Crassus had taught her how to use it the day before. I only briefly explained the principles of the flame blast spell to her yesterday, and I was planning to teach it to her today. Could it be that she learned it herself? Crassus' eyes widened with surprise, but more than that, he was elated. There's no need to talk about my disciple's aptitude. It's just a flame blast spell, so what's there to be surprised about? Wait until she summons a frost dragon in a few days. Julian pursed his lips as he strode toward the door. He was also unable to conceal the elation in his eyes as he murmured to himself, "Little Amy is extremely talented in fire magic, but I wonder how talented she is in ice magic." Fire and ice don't mix. I think Amy will give up on ice magic soon. Fire magic casters are the best at melee combat, Crassus retorted as he followed Julian out of the restaurant. System, customize a door, but don't install it right away, I'll do it later. Meg made his way out of the restaurant with a calm expression. Things were progressing more smoothly than he had anticipated. Ding. 20 gold coins have been successfully deducted. Customizing the restaurant door. The system's voice sounded. It was rare that it was not wrangling. Mr. Mac, you're amazing. Yarbemia looked at Mag's departing figure with a look of reverence on her face. She had thought that this was going to be a very bad situation, but Mag had easily resolved it with just a few words. Nothing had happened to the restaurant, but it was the people outside who were in trouble. He's very calm and meticulous. He must have thought everything through before he attacked, right? Sally looked at Mag's departing figure with a hint of approval in her eyes. Although Sally didn't like killing people, the guy in front of her was too disgusting. Sally also sensed a lot of evil aura from him, and even a bit of undead aura. This meant that he was definitely not a good person, and his hands were stained with the lives of innocent people. Sally also saw the crazed look in his eyes when he looked at Amy. That was most likely why Meg had tried to kill him. Sally didn't feel anything against Meg killing this guy. On her way to Chaos City, she had also killed a group of bandits who had slaughtered an elven village, and all of them had been killed by her arrows. Gudnia and Devoe had just woken up after being treated by the magic caster named Bob. Their wounds had already stopped bleeding, and a thin layer of scabs had formed over their bodies. Their mental states were slightly better, but that was all that a third-tier magic caster could do. We were only here to eat, but we were severely injured by that brat before we even entered the restaurant. You have to arrest her. Gudinia's face was filled with horror. This was the first time he had been so close to death. When the fireball exploded next to his ear, he thought that death was already upon him. And that boss, he must have ordered that kid to do this. Gabriel is dead, he's dead. Didn't the Grey Temple say that they would protect us? Hurry up and arrest them. Protect me. Devoe's expression was also similar. Deep fear had enveloped his heart. Even though he liked to see others being dominated by fear, he knew that it didn't feel good to be dominated by it himself. When wealth and status couldn't give him a sense of security, His life could also be easily threatened. DeVoe looked at the dead Gabriel lying in a pool of his own blood, and swore to himself that he would never come to this corner of the Aiden Square again. The Grey Temple was like a life-saving straw that the two of them were desperately trying to grasp onto. It gave them a sense of security, and they knew that the Grey Temple definitely wouldn't let them be killed. The Grey Temple will protect all citizens who abide by the law of the land, not bullies. Are you still trying to twist the truth? Brandley made his way out of the restaurant, and turned to Goodnear and DeVoe with a cold expression. Goodnear and DeVoe's expressions immediately changed upon hearing this. They didn't know what had just happened in the restaurant, but if that was the case, then it would be very difficult for them to get out of here alive. Master Brandley, I am the owner of DeVoe's Tavern and a board member of the Aiden Chamber of Commerce. We've met at a banquet held by the Chamber of Commerce not long ago. DeVoe forced a fawning smile onto his face as he tried to worm his way into being friends with Brandley. Even if you're the president of the Aiden Chamber of Commerce, you'll still be severely punished by the law for what you did today. Brandley's expression remained unchanged as he looked at DeVoe through narrowed eyes. Also, I've met many people in Chaos City. I'm innocent. We're just customers who came here to eat, and we didn't do anything. Goodnear was on the verge of a mental breakdown. He had wanted the Grey Temple to back them up, but it appeared that the Grey Temple was on Meg's side now. Look, Master. Right at this moment, Basil suddenly strode over to Gabriel's body, and pushed it over to reveal a black iron cross. That's a black iron cross. Everyone from the Grey Temple looked at the 5-centimeter-tall iron cross, and their expressions changed drastically. They then turned to Gabriel's body with rage and disgust in their eyes. What's that? Brandley asked in a perplexed manner. Meg was also looking at the iron cross with a curious expression. It seemed to have been cut from a sheet of black iron, and judging from the expressions of everyone from the Grey Temple, it seemed to be of some extraordinary origin. Not long ago, there were 3 cases of torture and murder in Chaos City. 2 of the victims were children who were less than 10 years old. Their bodies were dismembered in an extremely cruel manner, and a black iron cross was left behind at the crime scenes. Basil picked up the black iron cross from the ground, and said in a cold voice, "It's exactly the same as this one. It's a 4th-tier incident." Chapter 247. So you're saying that there's a very good chance that this person is the perpetrator of those 3 brutal murders? Brandley's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, but his brows then furrowed as he said, "But even though the victims were all ordinary people, they should have been treated as 3rd-tier incidents at most. How did they become 4th-tier incidents? 3 years ago, there was a massacre in Chaos City. A family of 4 was tortured to death. The male head of the family was a deputy invigilator of the night test, a 4th-tier knight. He had just been promoted to head invigilator that day. After attending a celebration party, he came home drunk. The female head of the family and 2 children under the age of 10 were tortured to death. Only a black cross was left at the scene." Basil clenched his fists with a dark expression as he looked at Gabriel's body, and gritted his teeth as he said, "Judging from the black cross and the method of murder left behind at the scene, these 2 cases were connected by the same person." Gabriel. Serial murders. DeVoe stared at Gabriel's body with horror etched on his face. No matter what the result was, there was no way that he would be able to escape unscathed. After running the tavern for so many years, he had a lot of dirty hands. If he were to be investigated, he would be spending the rest of his life in the Bastille prison. How is this possible? Goodenia's face was also filled with shock and horror as he stumbled back a couple of steps. He had only come here to make Mag apologize to him, but now, even a 4th-tier incident had been dragged into this. If he were to be dragged into this, he would at least be in serious trouble, if not dead. Take the body back and make sure it's safe. Brandley's expression had also become extremely grave as he turned to DeVoe and Goodnear with a cold expression, and said, "Take the 3 of them back to the Bastille prison and interrogate them to see if this is a gang crime." Yes. The members of the patrol office responded and took out ropes to tie up DeVoe, Goodnear, and Johnny. Right at this moment, a team of 6 members of the Grey Temple arrived on horseback. Each of them had a silver dew character embroidered on their chests, and the leader of the team cupped his fist in a salute toward Brandley as he reported, "Master Brandley, we're from the Metropolitan Police. We've received a third-tier incident report. You're just in time. All of you, take the body back and let the forensic doctor examine it." "It's a fourth-tier suspect," Brandley interrupted. "Yes." The man was stunned for a moment, but when his eyes fell on the black cross in Beza's hand, his expression suddenly became serious. Someone took out a simple stretcher from the horse's back and covered the corpse with a layer of white cloth. After that, the guards left directly. "I'm innocent, my lord. He was wrongly accused. We are all good citizens, good citizens. That black cross must belong to the owner of the restaurant. He must have framed us." Devo, who was pulled up, came back to his senses and yelled at the top of his lungs. Beza walked over with a cold face and kicked Devo's lower abdomen with his knee. With a muffled sound, Devo slowly squatted down with his hands covering his stomach. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth was wide open. Tears were flowing out, and he was in so much pain that he could not speak. "Bob, shut them up and take them back," Beza said coldly. "Yes." The magic caster beside him hurriedly replied. This was the first time that he had seen Beza lose control of his emotions like this. He raised his wand and chanted a few incantations, and two moss-like green things were plastered to the mouths of Devo and Gudnia. The three of them then left with the guards. Gudnia struggled with all his might, and turned to look in the direction of Amy's. He saw Meg standing at the entrance of the restaurant with a calm expression, and he suddenly regretted messing with this terrifying man. "Watch where you're going." Monkey, who was holding him up, elbowed him in the face without leaving a trace. His expression was similarly cold. "Monkey, why did Boss have such a big reaction today?" Bob followed along behind Monkey with a perplexed look. "That night examiner is Boss' best friend. On the night of the incident, the two of them had a second round of drinking." Monkey's voice was a little low. He stopped and turned around to look at Bob, whose mouth was agape, and warned, "Don't mention this in front of Boss." "Understood." Bob nodded seriously, and didn't say anything else. Brandley turned to Meg with a serious expression, and said, "On behalf of the Grey Temple, I'd like to express my gratitude to Mr. Mac and Amy for their contributions in subduing the criminals. Once we find out that he's the murderer, the Grey Temple will also offer the rewards for both cases as a reward." "You're welcome." Mag hurriedly waved his hands. This sudden turn of events had also stunned him. He was still thinking about how to get out of this incident safely, but he had suddenly become a great hero who got rid of evil and brought peace to the people, and he was even going to receive a reward. Furthermore, after hearing Beza's words, the knot in his heart had completely disappeared. Stabbing that chopstick into Gabriel's throat was the right thing to do. Gabriel was indeed a rabid dog that had eaten people before. "Thank you. Their family of 4 can rest in peace now." Beza stepped forward and extended his hand to Meg. He looked into his eyes and said sincerely, "I'm Beza. If there's a chance, I'd like to have a drink with you. I've quit drinking recently, but you're welcome to dine in the restaurant." Meg shook his hand. Beza seemed to know the family of 4 that had been killed, but Meg didn't ask too much. "I told you that Amy was always right." Her eyes could tell the difference between good and evil, and she knew when to hold back, Crassus said with a smile, and his tone was full of pride. "If I were to teach her for a day, those 2 brats would be dead in one move." Julian pursed his lips. "Both of you are right. This was an emergency, and I had to rush back to the Grey Temple to help out. Please forgive me for any inconvenience caused," Brandley said with a smile. He then turned to Meg and said, "Mr. Mac, please thank Amy for me. I heard that. I don't know what you're thanking me for, but you're welcome." Amy's voice sounded from behind him. Meg turned around to find Amy holding Ugly Duckling in one arm while stuffing some dried fish into her mouth with the other. Her little hand and expression immediately stiffened at the sight of Meg, and it was as if she had been caught doing something bad. She slowly removed the half-eaten dried fish from her mouth and handed it to Ugly Duckling, who was wearing an aggrieved expression. "Meow, Tilda." Ugly Duckling meowed at Meg with an aggrieved expression. "I'm praising Amy for defeating a big bad guy today." "Well done," Meg said with a smile. As expected, It wasn't very reliable to let Amy feed the cat herself. Really? Amy's eyes immediately lit up. Yes, Amy is a little hero. Brandley nodded with a smile. He then nodded at Meg before getting onto a horse-drawn carriage with Beza. Chapter 248. If Teacher Crassus hasn't eaten yet, then of course I'll cook for you. Meg smiled. He then turned to Julian and asked, Teacher Julian, would you like one as well? Julian hesitated for a moment before asking, is that okay? Of course. Just treat it as a tasting for a new product, but only a new product. Meg nodded with a smile. Then I'll have one as well. Julian nodded before also entering the restaurant with the birdcage in his hand. Hello, Master Halfbeard and Master Turtle. Amy greeted the two of them. She and Ugly Duckling both stared at the birdcage in Julian's hands with astonishment on their faces. You've changed, Black Coal. I didn't think that you two would still be able to find out even though I've hidden it so well. I've become even more handsome. I've sinned. Black Coal heaved a forlorn sigh as he raised his head with a forlorn expression. Amy shook her head as she pointed at Black Coal with a serious expression, and said, No, Black Coal. You've grown fur, and become even darker. Charcoal lowered his head to take a look, and immediately jumped up. He cried out in exaggerated surprise, Your Highness' royal robes are finally growing back. As expected, one must bear the weight of the crown if they wish to wear it. This must have been a test for me, and Your Highness has finally endured it. Meg wasn't in a hurry to enter the restaurant. Instead, he turned to Sally, who was also standing at the entrance, and asked, Aisha, can you help me put out the fire and clean up the bloodstains at the entrance of the restaurant? All right. Sally nodded before unleashing a first-tier waterball spell onto the burning horse-drawn carriage, putting out the fire instantly. She then unleashed 2 water-type spells to clean up the bloodstains at the entrance of the restaurant. The stench of blood instantly disappeared, and the ground became extremely clean as if nothing had happened. Boss, can we clean up the restaurant now? Yarbemia asked Meg. Yes, it's done. Meg looked at the mess in the restaurant and nodded with a smile. Since that guy was a vicious murderer, there was no problem at all. He turned around and entered the restaurant. He wrote a new notice and pasted it next to the doorpost. He changed the wording. The restaurant was smashed by a murderer and is in the process of emergency recovery. It will be closed for the day and a new product will be released tomorrow. Did you see that? The Grey Temple didn't capture the restaurant owner? Yeah, one of the troublemakers died. I didn't expect that all the people who were arrested were troublemakers, but the restaurant owner is fine. What's so strange about that? If you don't have the ability to cause trouble, you deserve to be beaten to death. This is the rule set by the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle. That's true, but not everyone can solve it so easily. I think there must be someone behind this boss. Otherwise, with such a big thing happening, he would have been taken away at least for today. The restaurant would have to close for a while. All of the onlookers began to discuss spiritedly among themselves upon seeing this. They were all speculating who Meg's backer was. Even something like this could be resolved so easily. Crassus and Julian turned to look at Sally at the same time. They looked at each other before looking away and sitting down in their usual seats. Black Coal's birdcage had already been placed on the ground by Amy, and she was staring at it from both sides. Meow tilde Ugly Duckling opened its mouth and meowed at Black Coal. It poked at the birdcage with its little paws, trying to reach through the gaps to grab Black Coal. Unfortunately, its legs were too short, and it couldn't reach Black Coal at all. Black Coal looked at Ugly Duckling with a disdainful expression, and said, Emmett, look at you. You want to touch me? Meow. Ugly Duckling immediately refused to back down. It shook the cage with its little paws, looking as if it were going to open the cage and fight Black Coal. Come here. Black Coal hollered at Ugly Duckling proudly from inside the cage. Is this the door of the cage? Amy suddenly asked curiously as she pointed at the small door at the side. Master Amy, I don't think this is a door. Why don't we talk about something happier, like singing? Black Coal's voice suddenly became ingratiating. No, Black Coal, your singing is terrible. I don't want to hear it. I want to see you fight with Ugly Duckling. Amy shook her head. She reached out with her little hand and tried to pry open the door bolt with some effort. Ugly Duckling also ran over with an eager expression. Then we can talk about dancing. I'm actually the little prince of dancing. As long as it's a dance you can name, I can dance. Black Coal's voice was filled with despair. I don't want to see a bird with eyebrows dance. Amy still shook her head. She lowered her head and studied it seriously for a while. Suddenly, her eyes lit up, and she pressed the door bolt lightly. With a soft click, the door bolt popped out by itself. Master, I'm a bird. Why do I have to fight with a stupid cat? This isn't fair. Ugly Duckling yelled in despair as it stretched out its neck and bit the door with its mouth. Meow. Ugly Duckling grabbed the door with its paws excitedly and slowly pulled it outward, preparing to enter the cage and fight with that annoying bird. Why don't we talk about why this stupid cat got fatter? Black Coal's voice was filled with despair. Patter. Amy pressed her hand on the door, and the door that was about to be opened by Ugly Duckling closed again. The door bolt locked itself automatically. She nodded and pointed at Ugly Duckling, and said, right? Do you also think Ugly Duckling got fatter? Yes, it got fatter. Black Coal heaved a sigh of relief. He hurriedly nodded in agreement, and said, and it's not just a little fat, it's very fat. If it continues to get fatter, you won't be able to carry it in a while. Did you hear that, Ugly Duckling? I'm not the only one saying that you've gotten fatter. Everyone can see that. So, you have to run 10 laps around the restaurant before you go to bed tonight, and you're not allowed to eat anything at night. Amy looked at Ugly Duckling with a serious expression. Then, she pulled out a piece of dried fish from somewhere and put it into her mouth. She took a bite, and began to eat happily. Meow Tilda Ugly Duckling looked up at Amy with an aggrieved expression, and its sapphire blue eyes were watery. Not only did she have to run, she even stole my dinner, and she called me fat. Meg walked out of the kitchen with 2 bowls of braised chicken and rice. He looked at Amy, who was eating dried fish while lecturing Ugly Duckling with a serious expression, and a smile appeared on his face. Amy didn't know about the murder, and he wasn't going to let her know. He put down the 2 bowls of braised chicken and rice with a smile, and said, Teachers, this is the new dish that the restaurant is going to release, braised chicken and rice. Chapter 249. The aroma of the chicken mixed with that of the mushrooms. The tantalizing aroma made one salivate uncontrollably. The combination of the golden chicken and the shiitake mushrooms was so tantalizing. This meat. Julian furrowed his brows. He was still a little cautious when it came to meat. Although he had eaten a lot of meat in the restaurant, he had never tried chicken. After a moment of hesitation, he picked up his chopsticks and put a piece into his mouth. The delicious chicken soup wrapped around the tender chicken. The flavor exploded in his mouth. The chicken didn't have the slightest bit of rank odor. Its freshness was enhanced to the extreme by the aroma of the mushrooms. The cooking temperature was just right. The chicken was at its most tender and refreshing when it was taken out of the pot. It was a little less hard and a little more dry. The feeling of biting the chicken with his teeth was so wonderful. The delicious and thick chicken soup made him sink into it. The delicious taste danced on the tip of his tongue. He was only willing to swallow it after chewing it carefully. A warm feeling flowed from the top to the bottom of his legs. The heat in his body seemed to have increased slightly. This is. Julian's eyes lit up. The Ruggiamo from before had some effect on dispelling the chill. He didn't expect the braised chicken to be even more effective. Although it only increased his heat, it was already very rare for someone like him who usually felt cold all over. Is chicken always this delicious? Julian couldn't help but put another piece into his mouth. It had been a few decades, and he had completely forgotten the taste of chicken. However, he was sure that the chicken he had eaten in the past definitely wasn't this delicious. How could he forget such a wonderful taste? After eating 2 pieces of chicken, Julian took a bite of rice. The rice was fragrant and delicious, and the more he chewed, the sweeter it became. It was a perfect match for the delicious chicken. 1 bite of chicken, 1 bite of rice, and some side dishes. It was so delicious that he couldn't stop eating. Is it really that delicious? Even the damned old man who doesn't like to eat meat is eating it with such relish. Crassus glanced at Julian, who couldn't stop eating. He also picked up his chopsticks and put a shiitake mushroom into his mouth. The shiitake mushroom had absorbed the delicious chicken soup. With a light bite, the chicken soup overflowed. He felt as if he had fallen into a pond filled with rich chicken soup. The wonderful taste made every cell in his body feel as if they had been opened, and he was cheering in joy. What delicious mushrooms! This chicken soup is simply amazing, Crassus couldn't help but praise. He immediately picked up a piece of chicken and put it into his mouth. He enjoyed the delicious taste melting in his mouth. His eyes couldn't help but narrow, and his face was full of happiness and joy. Masters, let me tell you a little secret. If you pour chicken soup into rice, it will taste even better. I don't usually tell people. Remi looked back at the two of them and said softly, "Really?" Crassus and Urian were skeptical, but since it was Amy who said so, they picked up their spoons at the same time and poured the soup on the rice. After the soup was evenly absorbed by the rice, they scooped a spoonful of rice and put it into their mouths. N-T-A. The delicious it. One came the delicious taste. It to say it. There was with it. Mr. Mac, give me another bowl of rice. Crassus and Julian put down their empty bowls at the same time. They looked at Meg and said, "Okay." Meg picked up the two bowls with a smile and walked into the kitchen. "Host, the system recommends that you charge as usual. Reject this unreasonable request. 1 braised chicken with 1 bowl of rice. This will help increase sales." The system's voice sounded. "System, do you have friends?" Meg asked calmly as he scooped rice. "The system doesn't need friends. If I did, I believe many people would be willing to be my friend," the system said confidently. "No, normal people won't be friends with a stingy person like you. Don't tell people I'm your friend in the future." Meg pursed his lips and turned off the rice cooker. He continued, "Also, it's normal for customers to ask for more rice. Which braised chicken and rice restaurant doesn't allow customers to ask for more rice? It's okay to make money, but don't think about money. That will greatly reduce the customer's dining experience. Correct the host's mistake. Money doesn't have eyes in this world," the system said seriously. "All right, give me the price. All the ingredients today will be on me. I'm the one who caught the drumsticks," Meg said directly. He couldn't be bothered to argue with the system. The price of a braised chicken is as follows: 2 agarwood mushrooms, 100 copper coins, 1/4 sweet potato, 10 copper coins, 1/8 of alpine lettuce, 10 copper coins, 1/8 of a volcanic island fiery chicken drumstick, 100 copper coins, 1 bowl of moonlight fragrant rice, 25 copper coins. The total cost is 400 copper coins. Can't it be cheaper? It's not easy for me to set the price like this. Although the price was already very fair given the quality of the ingredients provided by the system, Meg still tried to ask. The price of the ingredients is provided to the host at a 50% discount after careful market research by the system. There's no bargaining. The system's reply didn't have the slightest intention of negotiating. "All right, it's settled then." Meg raised an eyebrow. The cost of the ingredients was 400 copper coins, so it shouldn't be a problem to set the price at 800 copper coins per serving. If he added rice, it would be 50 copper coins per bowl. Julian took the second bowl of rice, hesitated for a moment, and poured it all into the earthenware bowl. Then, he picked up a spoon and ate happily. Crassus stretched his neck to take a look, then poured it into the bowl as well. His face was full of happiness and joy. Burp, the two put down their spoons at almost the same time, then burped with satisfaction. "Mr. Mac, I think the day off you took was totally worth it. This new dish will definitely sell well." Crassus gave Meg a big thumbs up, but then he looked at Amy and shook his head. "But in the future, don't casually ask for leave for little Amy during class time. It's easy to delay her learning progress." "What's wrong with asking for leave? Learning is about balancing work and rest. A magician who stays in the magic room all day will only become a magic nerd," Julian said disapprovingly, pursing his lips. The two stared at each other. Ice and fire seemed to be clashing in an instant, and the atmosphere was slowly rising. Chapter 250. If I'm going to give it to Amy, of course it's going to be a magic caster's staff that can smash dragons and summon fireballs, Crassus said with a serious expression. Bullshit. Magic wands have to be small and elegant, and can be easily tucked away in one's sleeve. That's the standard for magic casters. Are you afraid that people won't know that you have a leg injury? Julian pursed his lips, and his hoarse voice raised a few octaves to express his displeasure. If you let a goblin get close to you with that chopstick of yours, I'm afraid you won't be able to defeat it, Crassus sneered as he looked at Julian. You're the only one who can get close to a goblin with that kind of thing. As a magic caster, you have to jump up and down like a monkey in a fight. That's an insult to magic casters. You're a disgrace to the magic world. Julian retorted mercilessly. Me. The two of them glared at each other and harumphed coldly at the same time. Their auras were still rising steadily, and sparks seemed to fly as their gazes met. It was as if they were going to start a fight at any moment. The atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly became tense, and even Sally stopped in her tracks as she looked on with a hint of apprehension in her eyes. Meg looked on from the side with a hint of concern. After all, if two great magic casters were to fight, the system's level 3 defense system wouldn't be able to stop them at all. When his gaze fell on Amy, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His daughter really wasn't afraid of things getting out of hand. Masters, you're not allowed to fight in the restaurant. If you fight, Amy will get angry, and if she gets angry, she'll ignore you, Amy said with a serious expression. Crassus withdrew his aura first, and looked at Amy with a smile as he said, "Little Amy, look at how beautiful my magic caster's staff is. If you want it, I can make a bluish-purple magic caster's staff for you using purplish-blue gold, and put a 9th tier purple-eyed beast's beast crystal on it. It's also purple. It's all purple. Amy loves purple." Amy's eyes immediately lit up. "Little Amy, look at how small and adorable this magic caster's staff is. It can be shrunk, so it's not heavy at all. You can put it in your pocket, and it won't get in the way when you're playing with other kids. Otherwise, how are you going to play with a magic caster's staff?" Urian pulled out a black wand that was around 10 centimeters in length from his sleeve. He twirled it around, and it immediately sprung into 2 halves, transforming into a wand that was around 30 centimeters in length. He then pressed the wand back again, and it reverted back to its original size. "Wow, this is great too. I also like to play with children. I don't want to carry a big stick around all the time." Amy looked at the little wand in Urian's hand, and stars were already beginning to appear in her eyes. "That's right. This is the kind of wand that little girls should be using. You'll be able to turn it into a wand with a simple wave of your hand. All of the other kids will be very envious of you." Urian nodded with a confident smile. "You came prepared. Shameless." Crassus stared at the shrunk magic caster's staff in Julian's hand, and he was starting to get a little anxious. It was most likely impossible to convince Julian in a short time, so he had no choice but to target Amy. However, magic caster's staffs were only that long, and it was best to make them solid. That way, they could ensure that the magic caster's staff wouldn't break during melee combat. Amy stared at the magic caster's staff in Julian's hand for a while before shaking her head. "But it's not going to work if it's too small. If I learn Master Halfbeard's magic and use such a small magic caster to bash a giant dragon's head, it won't hurt at all." "Then what do you want?" Crassus and Julian asked in unison. Both of them wore conflicted expressions. Their precious disciple's request was really difficult to satisfy. She wanted something small and delicate, yet big and small enough to bash a giant dragon. How was that possible? "I want it to be only as long as my palm when it's small, and as tall as me when it's big. It would be best if it could also transform into a long sword, and when it wants to fly, it could transform into a broom," Amy said with a serious expression. She paused momentarily before nodding. "That's all I want." "That's all?" Julian and Crassus' expressions immediately became a little peculiar. How was a palm-sized magic caster going to be able to do so many things? That was still a small request. She was going to drive their master to his grave. Master, is it super simple? Remi looked at the two of them expectantly and asked. The two of them hesitated momentarily at the sight of Amy's expectant gaze before nodding in unison. Yes, it's quite simple. Then can you really make it for Amy? It's a purple one, a super beautiful purple one, Amy said happily. I can understand the first 2 points, but why do you have to hide a sword in the staff? And why do you have to transform it into a broom when you want to fly? Crassus asked with a perplexed expression as he looked at Amy. Meg raised an eyebrow. He naturally knew why Amy had made such a request, but he didn't expect her to say it in front of Crassus and Julian. If they knew that he wanted to teach Amy swordsmanship, then he would be exposed. Because that way, Amy can pretend to be a female knight. They definitely won't be able to guess that I'm actually a magic caster. And don't all witches have brooms? I saw them painted on the walls outside the school building. Amy nodded earnestly. Crassus and Julian were both speechless. Do you really have to have both? Crassus asked again. If I can only choose one, then I don't want the broom. Amy hesitated for a moment before reluctantly giving up. Wand, staff, longsword. 3 completely different things had to be combined into a palm-sized staff. Crassus and Julian both fell silent and fell into deep thought. Master, you can't make it. Amy stood quietly for a while. Even though she was a little disappointed, she still consoled. That's all right, then Amy only needs a normal wand. Crassus stood up and looked at Amy with a serious expression as he said, Who said that? I'll definitely make a satisfactory staff for Amy. Julian also stood up and nodded solemnly. Don't worry, I'll leave it to you, Master. Yes, I believe in you, Master. Master is the best. Amy's eyes lit up again. She clasped the items in her hands and said, Then this big pig's tooth and purple eagle's eye, you can keep it for fun. The materials of 2nd and 3rd tier magic beasts are too inferior. They're more suitable for toys. I'll go back and do some research. Crassus shook his head with a smile and turned to leave. I'll go do some research too, Julian also said, and got up to follow Crassus out. Goodbye, Master Halfbeard, Master Turtle, Amy said to the two of them. Chapter 251. There's no way we're going to work together, not in this lifetime. Julian's voice was very resolute. He took a couple of steps forward before turning back to Crassus, and said, You can provide the materials for the staff, but I'll make the wand. That's not an issue. However, if we want to solve the problem of spatial scaling, we'll have to ask Novan for help. He's the most proficient in spatial magic, and we'll have to put a sword in the staff. Crassus followed along with Julian, and the two of them walked side by side. In order to create a weapon that combined a wand, a staff, and a long sword, they were working together for the first time in their lives. If other magic casters on the continent were to see this, they would most likely be shocked out of their wits. At the entrance of the restaurant, Amy turned to Meg with an expectant look in her eyes, and asked, Father, can they really make it? Seeing as they say they can, then there should be no issues. Meg looked on as Crassus and Julian walked into the magic potion shop, and nodded with a smile. He was looking forward to seeing what kind of wand these two magic casters would be able to create. That's strange. Why isn't the blacksmith shop in Morby open today? Meg looked at the blacksmith shop with its doors tightly shut. No wonder he didn't come out even though there was such a huge commotion. The onlookers on the streets had already dispersed, but the discussion about the incident at Mammy Restaurant was still ongoing. Regardless of whether someone had died or all the troublemakers had been arrested while Mammy Restaurant was completely unscathed, there were many versions of the story that had been spread among the crowd. Amy's is not to be messed with. However, everyone came to the same conclusion in the end. Someone had identified the two fatties who had been taken away. They were board members of the Aden Chamber of Commerce, and they were quite influential figures in Chaos City. Yarbemir set up all of the tables and chairs as he turned to Meg, and asked, Boss, the tables and chairs are all ready. They're really good quality, and they're not damaged at all. It's just that they're missing a door. Do you need me to get a carpenter for you? The sawdust on the ground had also been cleaned up by Sally using magic. Aside from the fact that there was a door missing, the restaurant wasn't damaged at all. Meg looked at the two of them with a smile, and said, "Leave that to me. You can go back now. Just treat it as a vacation, and be at the restaurant before 7 a.m. tomorrow. You must have been scared by what happened today." "How could that be?" "Boss and Amy caught the serial killer. You're heroes. Even the Grey Temple wants to reward you." Yarbemia looked at Meg and Amy with admiration in his eyes. He then lowered his head in dejection, and said, "If I were you, I would have been so scared that I wouldn't know what to do. That man was so scary, and he even had a sword. MIA, you're very strong, and your bone structure and dexterity are also very high. If you practice swordsmanship, you'll improve very quickly. You'll be able to defeat that guy in about half a year," Sally said to the dejected Yarbemia. "Really?" Yarbemia stared at Sally with incredulity in her eyes. Meg also re-evaluated Yarbemia upon hearing that. Yarbemia was a little thin, but his strength was comparable to that of a first-tier knight. After unleashing his dragon tail, he could very well reach the standard of a second-tier knight. With such strength, he would have an innate advantage in swordsmanship, especially when it came to heavy swords. The weight of the sword in his hands was completely incomparable to that of a beginner. Just as Sally had said, Yarbemia was indeed a good candidate for swordsmanship. Even if he started now, he might be able to achieve great things. "Of course it's true." Sally nodded earnestly. "But, even if I want to practice swordsmanship, no one will teach me." Yarbemia shook his head, but he didn't seem too dejected. Instead, a smile appeared on his face, and he said, "Besides, I like working in the restaurant. If I have to give up my job to practice swordsmanship, then I'd rather not practice swordsmanship. Yes, I also think that working in the restaurant is better." Sally nodded in agreement. Meg looked at MIA and Sally. He didn't think that the two of them would place so much importance on working in the restaurant. However, he wasn't in a hurry to teach Yarbemia swordsmanship. Even though he felt that this girl was very good, it would be very easy for his identity to be exposed if he taught her swordsmanship. After all, she wasn't Amy. "All right, boss, we're going back now. See you tomorrow." "Bye, Amy." Yarbemia scanned the restaurant, and after making sure that there was nothing left to clean up, he waved at Meg and Amy. "Bye," Sally also said to the two of them. "Bye." Meg nodded. "Bye, big sister MIA, big sister Sally. Come back tomorrow and dance spring is here again." Amy waved at the two of them in an enthusiastic manner. After watching the two of them leave, Meg looked at Amy, who was yawning, and Ugly Duckling, who was lying on the ground and looking at him pitifully. He asked with a smile, "Ugly Duckling, are you full?" "Meow, meow." Ugly Duckling shook its head immediately and looked at Amy as if complaining. "I think it's already full," Amy said hesitantly. "Meow." Ugly Duckling shook its head vigorously to express its objection. "Then eat a little more. Ugly Duckling is still growing. It can't be hungry." Meg looked at Ugly Duckling's pitiful look, and couldn't bear to see it like this. After all, most of the dried fish had been eaten by Amy, and it had run out to play in the morning. It was probably hungry now. "All right, then I'll have to add 5 more laps to the evening run." Amy shrugged her little shoulders with a hint of resignation in her voice. "Meow." Ugly Duckling lay on the ground weakly and gave up completely. Meg brought Amy and Ugly Duckling upstairs, and gave Ugly Duckling 2 small fishes to eat. Then, he coaxed the 2 little fellows to sleep before going downstairs. Meg walked to the door and looked left and right to make sure that no one was paying attention to them. He directly said in his mind, "System, install the door. Installation fee, 1 gold coin." The system's voice sounded. "Holy shit. Don't all the doors come with installation services?" Meg raised his eyebrows. Although he knew that the system was a scammer, he didn't expect it to be so good at charging twice. After a round of brutal haggling, Meg successfully got the system to install the door at the installation fee of 10 copper coins. This could be considered another peak of his haggling. Meg looked at the door that was exactly the same as the original wooden door. After opening and closing it, and making sure that the installation was good, he was about to close and lock the door. Chapter 252. Aiden Square Delicious Cuisine Rankings? Meg opened the door and looked at the two middle-aged men in red vests. He shook his head and said, "Not interested." Then he closed the door. Alvin and Luther looked at each other in surprise. Generally, newly opened restaurants were very enthusiastic about things like the Aiden Cuisine Rankings. After all, as long as they entered the top 100, it was equivalent to having an additional advertising opportunity for all diners. That was something that could directly increase their turnover. Of course, it was basically impossible for a new restaurant to enter the top 100, but there had never been a boss who refused without even thinking. "Luther, let's go." It seems that the owner is quite self-aware. If a restaurant that has only been open for a dozen days can make it onto the list, some people will doubt the authority of our gourmet cuisine ranking, Alvin said unhappily as he closed the book in his hand. "I don't think any restaurant in the Aiden Square would use such a large piece of crystal as a decoration. Maybe they have a lot of money." Luther pointed at the floor-to-ceiling glass with a surprised expression. Meg was indeed not interested in the so-called gourmet rankings. These things had always been prepared for those customers who did not have their own opinions and wanted to find their own delicacies. Moreover, the restaurants on the rankings were usually not the ones with the best and most unique tastes, but the ones with the highest prices and the highest number of customers. This was because only they could have a large number of votes. The real delicacies were often hidden in the restaurants in the middle and lower reaches. Some restaurants would not even appear on the list. They were hidden in some corner of the city, waiting for customers to discover them. Of course, the most important thing was that Meg no longer had to worry about the source of customers. Instead of welcoming a large wave of sightseeing customers every day because of his ranking, he preferred to receive familiar faces with spending power every day. After all, he could only provide so much food every day. Why would he need so much attention? Ding. New mission issued by the system. Host, please place a dish in the top 30 of this month's Aiden Square Delicious Cuisine Rankings. Mission reward, 1 Haagen-Dazs's ice cream set recipe. Mission failure penalty, a fine of 10,000 gold coins. At this moment, the system's voice suddenly sounded. "Wait a minute, system. What did you just say about the punishment for failing the quest?" Meg's footsteps came to a halt. He felt as if he had misheard something. Mission failure penalty, a fine of 10,000 gold coins, the system repeated. What the fuck? System, although I know you like money, can you not make it so obvious? What kind of system gives you a fine for failing a mission? Meg couldn't help but roar in his heart. However, he still opened the door. With an awkward expression, he said to the two men who were about to turn around and leave, "Wait a minute, I thought about it. I'm still a little interested." Alvin and Luther turned around and looked at Meg in confusion. "Boss, are you saying that you're going to participate in the Aiden Square food competition?" Luther asked. "Yes, do we need to do anything?" Meg smiled and nodded, cursing in his heart. Poverty was indeed a sin. For 10,000 gold coins, he had no choice but to lower his head to the system. Of course, Meg was also a little tempted by the Haagen-Dazs ice cream set. It was the favorite of children, and Amy would definitely like it. She would definitely look adorable when she saw the little one eating ice cream. "It should be a piece of cake for me to get into the top 30, right?" Meg was also very confident. He didn't believe that there was anyone in the Aiden Square who could cook better food than him. Not to mention the top 30, he was confident that he could get into the top 3. The two men were both of medium build and around 40 years of age. Their bellies were bulging, indicating that they ate a lot. The red vests they were wearing had a pot and a spoon embroidered on the chest, and the words Aiden Square Catering Association embroidered on the back. The man on the left was carrying a cloth bag. "If you want to participate, you'll have to pay a registration fee of 5 gold coins. Then, we'll add your restaurant to the preliminary list. Starting tomorrow, customers will vote using small ballots for 10 days. In the end, the top 100 restaurants with the highest scores and votes will be selected for this month's rankings." Alvin looked up at the name of the restaurant before writing it down in his notebook. He then extended a hand to Meg in a very natural manner. "That's it." Meg wasn't in a hurry to pay. 5 gold coins for just writing down the name of a restaurant was a little too much. Of course not, but the rest of the process will have to wait until the registration fee is collected, Luther said with a smile. 5 gold coins. Mag hesitated for a moment before taking out 5 gold coins from his pocket and handing them to Arvin. It seemed that they were very familiar with this process. They held it once a month, so they could earn a lot of money just from the registration fee alone. Very good. This is a special voting ticket. Boss, after you pay the bill, you can give this ticket to the customers. With this ticket, the customers can evaluate and vote on the delicacies of the restaurant. The final voting result will be based on the evaluation of all the customers who have entered and spent in the restaurant. Then, the number of customers and the amount of money spent will be combined to give a final cumulative score. Luther pulled out 2 stacks of 5 cm wide and 10 cm long cards from the cloth bag in his hand. At the same time, he extended his other hand to Meg with a smile, and said, "These are ticket papers with the association's special magic anti-counterfeiting symbol. 100 of them per stack, and 1 gold coin per stack. How many stacks do you need, boss? Fuck. There must be a chain of interests behind this. If 1 ticket paper costs 1 copper coin, wouldn't those restaurants with high traffic spend tens of thousands on tickets? This doesn't even include the cost of finding sponsors. I don't think it's possible to get into the top 10 without at least 100,000 or 200,000, right?" Meg raised his eyebrows. It seemed that he had thought of the problem too simply, and the otherworldly merchants were too simple-minded. They were even better at this kind of trick. "How many tickets do you need to get into the top 30? Meg asked tentatively. "Top 30? That's hard to say. If the restaurant's dishes are more expensive, 2,000 or 3,000 tickets would be enough. If it's like the green onion pancakes that cost 5 copper coins per serving, it would be difficult to get into the top 100 even with 10,000 tickets. But if it's your restaurant, I suggest you buy fewer tickets. It would be a waste to use them all up." Luther turned to Mag with a hint of surprise on his face. He didn't think that his father, who was still so young, would be interested in the top 30 of the rankings board once he became interested in it. One had to know that the top 30 restaurants this month were all at least 3 years old, and they were all quite large. Most of them even had the Aden Chamber of Commerce's emblem hanging on their doors. It was simply a fool's dream for a newly opened restaurant to want to get a share of the profits. Chapter 253. 2,000 tickets. Luther turned to Meg with a surprised look on his face. 2,000 tickets wasn't a lot compared to the tens of thousands of tickets that a typical restaurant would require, but for a restaurant that had only recently opened, 2,000 tickets was a little excessive. "That's right." Meg nodded. If the votes were related to how much the customers spent, then he was very confident again. There was probably no restaurant in the Aden Square whose prices were higher than his. Judging by the number of customers who came in every day, 2,000 tickets would probably only last him for a few days. Spending a few thousand to get a Haagen-Dazs's recipe was definitely worth it. As the representative of high-end ice cream, Meg was actually quite fond of it himself. He didn't think that the system would give him this as a reward. Luther looked at Meg with a serious expression, and said, "Then I have to tell you that these tickets are non-refundable, and they'll become invalid after the expiration date. The magic anti-counterfeiting symbol on the tickets only lasts for 15 days, but if you don't have enough tickets, you can buy more at the voting booth." "No problem. Come on in, I'll go get the money." Meg nodded before entering the restaurant. "I didn't think that the owner would be so rich, but he's not very smart." Alvin chuckled. "Sure, don't let them hear us. But since it's like this, we've completed our mission for today. There are exactly 2,000 tickets left in the bag. We've emptied them all at once." Luther's expression was also somewhat excited as he pushed open the door and entered the restaurant. Wow! Both of their eyes widened as soon as they entered the restaurant. There were 2 luxurious crystal chandeliers in the restaurant, and the warm yellow lights were very comfortable to look at. The 16 wooden tables were arranged in an orderly manner, and the colors and patterns on the tables and chairs were all the same, creating a very comfortable and harmonious atmosphere. Even though they couldn't understand the illustrations on the walls, The decorations hanging on the walls were quite eye-catching. The two of them had been selling tickets at all of the restaurants in the Aden Square for years, so they were quite discerning. They had seen plenty of luxurious restaurants and restaurants that were hundreds of square meters in size, but this was the first time they had seen a restaurant that looked so comfortable and luxurious. If they had to choose, they would rather have a meal here than those luxurious restaurants that were almost blinding and those big restaurants that could seat hundreds of people. This restaurant will definitely become popular. This was the first thought that came to their minds. 2 dragon coins. Meg took the money from the counter and handed it to Luther. All right, a restaurant can recommend a maximum of 5 dishes to compete for the rankings. Customers can also write down 5 dishes in a single vote. You can choose 5 dishes from the restaurant's menu, and we will record them for voting, Luther said to Meg after receiving the money. 5. Meg's expression suddenly became awkward. Boss, just choose the 5 best-selling dishes in your restaurant. Generally speaking, these are the easiest ones to get on the list. Alvin said with a smile. They had seen this kind of situation many times. Many bosses were struggling with which dishes to put on the table. System, help me put the braised chicken and rice on the menu. The price is 800 copper coins, and the rice is 50 copper coins per bowl. Meg said in his heart. He was not conflicted about which dish to choose, but there were too few dishes on the menu. He could not even get 5 dishes. Ding. Writing complete. 20 copper coins have been deducted, the system's voice sounded. Then you guys can copy according to the menu. The sweet tofu pudding counts as 1 dish, and the savory one counts as 1 dish. That'll make it 5 dishes. Meg picked up a menu from a nearby table and handed it to Luther. There are only 4 dishes. Luther couldn't help but exclaim as he scanned the menu. This price. Boss, you didn't write it wrong, did you? Alvin also leaned over to take a look, and his eyes immediately widened. Even the cheapest dish on the menu cost 200 copper coins, and the most expensive, the braised chicken and rice, cost 800 copper coins per bowl, and the rice was 50 copper coins per bowl. They had scoured the entire Aden Square, but had rarely seen such a price. Even the Duca's restaurant, which was ranked number 1 on the Aden Square food rankings, was only selling its roast lamb for 2,500 copper coins, and that was only enough for 3 servings of braised chicken and rice. What kind of absurd price was this? The same thought flashed through Luther's and Alvin's minds at the same time. Just a moment ago, they thought that this restaurant's style made it unreasonable for it to not become popular, but with such a high price, it would be a miracle if it could become popular. Just write according to the menu. Meg didn't bother to explain, and nodded as he gestured for them to copy the menu. All right. Luther couldn't be bothered to say anything more. He took out a small notebook and copied down the prices of the dishes one by one. When he reached the braised tofu pudding, he asked, Boss, are you really going to split this dish into 2 dishes? Yes, then just write down the sweet tofu pudding and the savory tofu pudding. Meg nodded with a smile. This really wasn't a single dish. All right, then we'll put up these 5 dishes for you when the time comes. Luther nodded and closed the notebook. He took out all the tickets from the bag and piled them on the table. After bidding farewell to Meg, he left. This boss is rich, but I don't think he's very smart, Alvin said softly as he looked back at the restaurant. I agree with you this time. Luther nodded. A normal boss wouldn't set such a high price when the restaurant had just opened, right? As for the 2,000 tickets, Luther thought that it would be a good thing if Meg could use 10 of them. If there were no customers to vote, it would be embarrassing for the restaurant to be at the bottom of the hundreds of restaurants. These 2,000 tickets will probably only last for 3 or 4 days. I'll have to buy more when the time comes. This catering association really is a blood-sucking parasite. Meg picked up a ticket and looked at it, and his heart ached for his money. If Sally officially joined the restaurant tomorrow, the restaurant would be able to provide over 100 plates of Yangju fried rice, over 600 rujiamos, 900 plates of tofu pudding, and an unknown amount of braised chicken and rice. Although many of the dishes would be repeated purchases, there should be close to 1,000 customers a day. This was the benefit of increasing his physical fitness. Before he recovered, he wouldn't be able to cook so much food even if he worked himself to death. With the increase in his physical fitness, his cooking efficiency should continue to increase. However, at that time, he would have to consider the problem of expanding the restaurant. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a place for the customers to sit. System, we don't have to worry about customers anymore. Why are you still giving out such useless missions? Meg asked in his mind, perplexed. Host, as a candidate for the god of cookery, how can you be satisfied with the status quo? Conquer the Aden Square with food. Conquer the Norland continent. Conquer this world. This is the ambition and confidence that a god of cookery should have. The system's impassioned voice sounded. Chapter 254. My lord, from what I've seen in the past 2 days, Miss Sally should have become a waitress in that restaurant. She's still staying in this inn and working 2 jobs. In an alley outside Gaia Hotel, a young elf wrapped in a black robe said softly, "Yes." Ingwe nodded as he looked in the direction of Gaia Hotel. After a brief silence, he asked, "Have you done a background check on the hotel and restaurant?" The hotel is owned by a woman, and she's been running it for over a decade. Her husband disappeared during a mercenary mission 10 years ago, and is most likely dead. The restaurant has only been open for less than a month, so there's very little information about it. The owner is a human, and there's a half-dragon waitress in the restaurant. However, he has a half-elf daughter, and she's been taken in as a disciple by 2 great magic casters. She seems to be very talented in magic, the young elf replied. Very talented half-elf? Ingwe raised an eyebrow as he turned to the young elf, and asked, which 2 great magic casters took her in as a disciple? Fire Lord Crassus and Frost Lord Julian, the half-elf hurriedly replied. How? How is that possible? Ingwe's eyes widened. As a 7th-tier magic caster, even though he was several hundred years older than Crassus and Julian, he was still considered to be at the pinnacle of the magic world. The battle between ice and fire had been going on for close to 100 years, and the outcome had yet to be decided. Now, they had taken in the same disciple. The last person they had begged to take in as a disciple was Princess Irina. She had become a 10th-tier magic caster at the age of 26, which was a testament to Crassus and Urian's foresight. Now, they were fighting to take in this half-elf girl as their disciple. How terrifying was her magic talent? Where's the restaurant? Ingwe asked. The elf had never seen such an expression on Ingwe's face before, and he hurriedly replied, it's on the westernmost side of the Aden Square. It's that restaurant in the corner. Ingwe's expression returned to normal, and he said with a serious expression, continue to keep an eye on Miss Sally and ensure her safety, but don't let her discover your existence. If she discovers you, run away immediately. Don't get involved with her. Yes. The elf hurriedly nodded before drawing a circle with his wand under his black robe. A burst of green light erupted from his body, and he disappeared on the spot, completely concealing himself. Third young master has already gotten up. He should be here in a few days. Ingwe took another look at the direction of the hotel before turning around and leaving. Meg agreed that a man with good cooking skills could conquer a woman's stomach. However, Meg felt that it was a bit far-fetched to say that a chef could conquer the world with food alone. System, did you lower the IQ of this world? Meg tried asking. The system doesn't have the authority to do that. Even the heavenly Tao can't do that. Lowering the IQ of this world is an irreversible action. Once the IQ of this world is lowered, those with low IQ will become mentally retarded. Furthermore, once the IQ of this world is out of balance, the world will be unable to continue functioning, and the world will collapse. The system replied with a serious expression. If you didn't lower the IQ of this world, then why did you give me such a completely illogical goal? Meg pursed his lips, and said, perhaps you can change it to conquering this world's stomach. Food is the most important thing to people. Host, if you can conquer this world's stomach, then theoretically speaking, you'll be their heavenly Tao. The system's voice was still impassioned. System. Did you read a pirated dictionary of idioms? The food here refers to food that can fill one's stomach, not delicious food. After 100 years of peaceful development on the Norland continent, there aren't many people left who can't fill their stomachs. Besides, they can't afford to eat restaurant food. Meg couldn't help but chuckle. Even so, as a candidate for the god of cookery, how can you go far on the path of becoming the god of cookery if you don't have lofty ideals and ambitions? So, young man, conquer this world's stomach. The system's attempt to twist the idiom had failed, but it still refused to give up. I've been away for half my life, and I'm already a middle-aged man when I come back. Don't pretend to be a young man. Mag pursed his lips and locked the restaurant's door. However, after being fooled by the system, his originally calm heart really was stirred up a little. Conquering the world was a little difficult, but conquering this world's stomach did seem to be an interesting thing. Giant dragons went crazy over delicious food, elves fell in love with skewers, demons lined up to munch on Ruggiamos, and more interesting customers came to his door to be conquered by delicious food. Just the thought of it was interesting. Haagen-Dazs's ice cream set meal. Have I ever complained about this before? I don't recall ever complaining about it. Meg went into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. His brows furrowed as he thought for a while, but he really couldn't remember if he had complained about it before. He didn't know what the system would ask for. Just as Meg was about to go upstairs for a nap, someone knocked on the door. Is anyone home? The restaurant is closed for the day, Meg said. He wasn't going to open the door. Mr. Mac, is it? I'm Hyder, the vice principal of the Chaos School of Mechanical Engineering. I'm not here to eat. I have something to ask you, the voice quickly said. What can I do for you, Principal Hyder? Meg opened the door with a glass of water in one hand. He was surprised to see a half-bald Hyder with a black briefcase under his arm. Meg had a good memory. He naturally remembered that when he was taking Amy to class 2 days ago, this vice principal of the School of Mechanical Engineering, who looked like a research-oriented scholar, had studied his bicycle and invited him to his office for a chat. However, he had refused, saying that he had to go back to cook. He didn't expect that he would come to him himself today. Heidel turned to Mag with a smile, and said, "It's like this. When I saw your bicycle the other day, I couldn't help but be struck by a sense of awe. We've been researching a steam-powered device for the past few years, but we've run into a bottleneck. Would you be willing to share some ideas with us?" Steam engine? Meg raised an eyebrow as he looked at Hyder with surprise. This world was still in the era of manual factories that relied on human and animal labor, and industrial development was still in the embryonic stage. However, if the steam engine was invented and used in daily life, there would soon be an industrial revolution, and the entire world would officially enter the age of steam. Chapter 255. Hyder walked into the dining room. His eyes lit up when he saw the luxurious dining room, but he didn't pay much attention to it. He turned to look at Meg with a smile and said, "Mr. Mac, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Please have a seat. I'm actually quite interested in these things." Meg smiled and put the glass of water in his hand on the table beside him. He went into the kitchen and poured another glass of water. He gently placed it in front of Hyder, who had just sat down, and pulled out a chair to sit in front of him. When it came to steam engines, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Mag knew them like the back of his hand. After all, he had completed an improved design for a 2-stroke reciprocating piston internal combustion engine on his own for his graduation project. Although this improvement proved to be difficult to put into practical use in the final experiment, it was theoretically able to increase the thermal efficiency by 3%. With this thesis, he had obtained a limited number of outstanding graduate positions. This was the only thing he did seriously in his 4 years of university. During this process, he also studied the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, and the steam turbine. He still remembered the structure and principle of all of them clearly. He even remembered a few classic parts and models. Of course, it was unrealistic for him to make these things with his own hands, but if he was asked to draw a few drawings and explain the principles, there would be no problem at all. To put it simply, as long as he was given a good blacksmith who could make standard parts, he could make a steam engine by himself and kick the world into the age of steam. However, Mag didn't have much interest in doing so. Regardless of whether it was Thomas Seville or Thomas Newcomen, who had invented the steam engine, or Watt, who had improved the steam engine, all of them had only left their names in the history of the steam engine. Mag wasn't very interested in leaving his name in history, but he was very curious about the level of machinery in this world. Thank you. Hyder put the glass aside and opened the cloth bag beside him. He took out a few drawings and put them on the table. He looked at Meg with a serious expression and said, "It's like this. We have been studying how to convert steam into kinetic energy, and then use it in production and life to replace animal power and improve production efficiency. And now, we have successfully converted it into kinetic energy. Although the output is still not stable, we already have an idea of how to stabilize it. Now, the problem that needs to be solved is how to transfer this energy to other objects and make this energy useful." Very bold and interesting idea. Mag looked at the crude blueprints on the table, and his eyes lit up as he looked at Heidel with a hint of respect in his eyes. In contrast with him, Heidel didn't have a giant's shoulder to stand on. It was already an extremely brilliant idea for him to be able to come up with the idea of using steam, and the fact that he had persisted in doing so was an admirable feat. Meg admired those scientists who immersed themselves in scientific research and inventions. Their whimsical ideas and years or even a lifetime of research constantly pushed human society forward. From the Industrial Revolution to the modern world, it only took a short 200 years. It could be said that the steam engine opened the curtain of this great era and accelerated the development of human society. And the man in front of him had almost achieved this. The thin charcoal drawings were a little rough, but the overall structure was very clear. It was a single-cylinder design. Steam would push the piston in the cylinder, and then external cooling would create a low-pressure state in the cylinder and push the piston back, forming a reciprocating motion. The connecting rod connected to the piston could obtain a certain amount of kinetic energy. This steam engine model was very similar to Newcomen's steam engine. As Hyder said, they had successfully turned steam into kinetic energy. However, they were still about a watt away from using this kinetic energy in production and life. But to be able to achieve this from scratch, Meg was very impressed with Hyder and his team. After all, in this world of swords and magic, people still worshipped knights who could ride on griffins and soar into the sky. Mechanics could be said to be a new and unpopular profession. If people were to tell people that one day, ordinary people could also fly into the sky and be even faster than leopards on land, they would probably only think of them as lunatics. Thank you. Hyder looked at Meg with some gratitude. He saw agreement in Meg's eyes and words. Unlike the perfunctory expression of ordinary people, and even the undisguised mockery, Hyder had experienced many of these things in the past 20 years. From a head of thick black hair to a bald head, no one knew what kind of pressure he and his team had endured in the past 20 years. Others envied their high salaries and subsidies, but few knew that they, as the core members, had used almost all of their savings for this project. He and his wife were still living in the old house that the school had allocated to them 20 years ago. He walked to class every day because he couldn't bear to pay a coachman and a horse. In a year, he had enough money to make another model. Apart from his wife, who had lived a poor life with him, even his 2 children couldn't understand these things. They only went home once a year. You're welcome. But I'm curious, why do you want to study this? Meg asked Hyder with a smile. Meg Alex's memories were almost all about swordsmanship and combat. After 100 years of relatively peaceful development on the Norland continent, commerce has developed tremendously. There are even many trading companies that span the entire continent. Manpower and animal power were beginning to be insufficient to meet the needs of production. Although magic was a very powerful existence, the high cost limited the use of magic by the workshop owners. Of course, the use of magic was still very common in some expensive and delicate products. So, we think that this world urgently needs a low-cost and high-efficiency power plant. This idea has been approved and supported by the City Lord's Castle. This is also why this project, which hasn't produced any effective results, has persisted until now, Hyder replied seriously. Yes, this is the best time. Meg nodded. According to Hyder, capitalism had developed to a certain extent on the Norland continent, and people were beginning to urgently need something that could effectively increase production efficiency. At this time, if a mature steam engine could be developed, it would definitely be popularized and used in a short period of time. This was probably why the City Lord's castle had the patience to support this money-burning project for over 20 years. Chapter 256. The system is warning the host that the host's thoughts may speed up the development of this world and bring about many unforeseen events. Therefore, the host should immediately stop your thoughts and do not act on them. The system's serious voice sounded, full of warning. System, do you want to sell it too? Meg asked calmly. The system is not that kind of system. The system will definitely not do something that could cause chaos in the world. The system's voice was still serious. Looking at the development of history, as long as the Hyder steam engine is introduced, it will not take many years for another steam engine to appear due to market demand. Then, the world will enter the era of industrial revolution. Therefore, this kind of development is completely foreseeable and unstoppable. Now that I'm throwing out a blueprint, I'm just shortening the time frame. Meg calmly refuted. But with the buffer of more than 20 years, the world can completely develop in other directions. Moreover, the host is using the history of Earth to set up this magical world. The system does not accept this kind of refutation. The system responded seriously. System, are you stupid? If I sell it for 50,000 gold coins, then I can directly upgrade the restaurant to LV2. In the end, all the money will end up in your pocket. I won't earn a single cent, and you're still here talking to me non-stop. Aren't you making things difficult for yourself? Meg could not help but roll his eyes in his heart. The system suddenly fell silent. Meg's mouth twitched. As expected, when it came to money, the system's moral values would fall off a cliff. No, host, this is a false proposition. Although the 50,000 gold coins will end up in my hands in the end, the 50,000 gold coins will only end up in my hands after you spend the money. In this case, the person who spent the money is still you. The system was silent for a minute, and its tone was a little annoyed. I didn't expect you to be so smart. Meg raised his eyebrows, a little surprised. Of course. The system's voice was a little proud, but it immediately reacted and said seriously, Host, please do not try to question the system's intelligence. I think this is the fastest way to make money at the moment. If you don't let me sell it, then I won't level up. I don't have money anyway, so I can't level up. Meg curled his lips and said indifferently. The system hesitated for a moment before saying, This system can provide the host with a top-notch plan. Speak, Meg said calmly. The system can provide the host with hundreds of classic steam engine blueprints. The host is only responsible for selling the blueprints. I'll take 80% and you'll take 20%. The system's voice was tempting. System, are you doubting my intelligence? Meg rolled his eyes and mocked, Do I need you to provide me with blueprints? I have a few classic models in my head. I even remember the craftsmanship standards of the parts. Don't even think about getting a share of this. I can even draw the blueprints of internal combustion engines with my bare hands. In the future, you won't have a share in the production of cars either. Are you angry? Beep beep beep. The system suddenly emitted a series of chaotic noises. Millimeter, that's right. Meg immediately felt a lot better. He turned to Hyder with a smile, and asked, Principal Hyder, what do you want to talk to me about today? It's still too early to talk about how to apply this energy to production, but I'd like to consult you on how to convert this type of piston motion into other types of motion. Of course, this kind of consultation isn't free of charge. I sincerely invite you to join our team. If your suggestions can be applied to the machine, then you'll become an official member. You'll enjoy the benefits of the City Lord's castle, and you'll also receive a recognized title in Chaos School. Hyder looked at Meg with a serious expression. It took him 25 years of research to come up with such a simple design. Wouldn't it be too hurtful for me to give him a fully formed steam engine that can be directly used? Meg looked at Hyder's sincere expression, then at the simple steam engine blueprints on the table, and was suddenly struck by the urge to draw a perfect steam engine blueprint. However, he repressed the urge in the end, and shook his head with a smile as he said, I'm just a chef, so I can only provide some layman's advice. Also, I probably won't be able to join your team. The restaurant is quite busy, so I probably won't have time to do anything else. At the last moment, Meg changed his mind. He decided not to hand over the steam engine blueprints so soon. Handing over the blueprints would be a one-off deal. There was no such thing as patent protection in this world. Selling something that could change the world for tens of thousands of gold coins wasn't something that a businessman would do. This was a very valuable bargaining chip. Even though Meg respected people like Hyder who were obsessed with invention and research, he wasn't naive enough to give away this bargaining chip. A strength point was very expensive, and it would only become more and more expensive in the future. Seeing as he was going to give this world a push, he had to pay him more for his hard work. You're the owner of the restaurant now. You're a businessman. You're an evil capitalist. Meg murmured to himself as he looked at Hyder with a calm expression. He clearly couldn't discuss business with Hyder. Firstly, it would seem like a capitalist was bullying an honest scholar. Secondly, he wasn't at that level yet. If he wanted to discuss business with him, he had to discuss it with the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple. That was the best way to maximize his profits. Once the steam engine was invented, it would provide stable and efficient kinetic energy in industry. Trains would be the easiest way to popularize it. Furthermore, it would become the most important mode of transportation and transportation. It would completely change the way people traveled. Only entities at the level of the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple would be able to popularize such a massive project. After all, Chaos City had a good relationship with all races. Perhaps a railway network with Chaos City as the center would be able to spread across the entire Norland continent in the future. Of course, if there really came a day when they would make a deal, Meg wouldn't mind including Hyder and the others. Researchers should enjoy the honor and reputation that they deserved. The City Lord's castle and Chaos School would definitely reward them handsomely. I see. Hyder was slightly disappointed. However, he quickly turned to Meg with anticipation in his eyes, and asked, "Then what do you think, Mr. Mack?" Chapter 257. At the entrance of the restaurant, Hyder looked at Meg, and said, "Mr. Mack, you really are a genius. After listening to your explanation, everything became clear to me. Although you don't want to join our team, if you're interested, you can research the steam engine on your own. If you need, we don't mind providing you with the necessary information. We won't compete with you for the results in the future. We only hope that the steam engine can be released as soon as possible to prove that what we've been doing is correct. All right. If I have time, I'll ask the president for advice." Meg looked at Hyder's serious expression, and suddenly felt a pang of guilt. Look at how open and honest this intellectual was. As a capitalist, he was full of guilt. However, Hyder's words had also given Meg an idea. If he were to suddenly come up with a steam engine and go to the City Lord's castle, that would be a little too abrupt. However, if he were to say that he had invented the steam engine based on Hyder's work, then everything would fall into place. Furthermore, with Hyder and the others as a lead, it would be a lot easier for him to collaborate with the City Lord. After sending Hyder off, Meg turned to enter the restaurant. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw an old elf with a white beard standing in the distance, looking in the direction of the restaurant. He seemed to have been standing there for some time, and seemed to have been observing him. He was still a little sensitive when it came to elves. The restaurant has had some elven customers recently, and nothing has happened. Maybe he's just a curious person? Meg thought to himself. He locked the door and lifted a corner of the curtain to take a look. The old elf was already gone. He put down the blinds in confusion, and didn't think too much about it. Amy had become the disciple of Crassus and Julian, and the restaurant's reputation was growing. There would only be more and more prying eyes. He had to learn to accept it calmly, and then accept it as if nothing had happened. He believed that no one in this world would believe that the king of dragonslayers who once dominated the sky would now become the owner of a restaurant in Chaos City. Cooking. That's my job. Meg went into the kitchen and threw the matter of the steam engine to the back of his mind. There was nothing wrong with the idea of earning some extra money. However, the restaurant was a stable source of income. Now, the net profit was easily over 200,000 copper coins a day. Moreover, with the increase in the number of dishes and the increase in cooking speed, this number should still have room for growth. I have to think of a way to get rid of this turkey as soon as possible. But there is so much chicken that little am I and I won't be able to finish it even after a few days. I have to use the ingredients provided by the system to make sure that the taste of each dish is not the slightest bit different. Meg opened the refrigerator and looked at the 2 compartments full of turkey chicken. He had a headache. Forget it. If I can't finish it, I'll just throw it away. I didn't buy it with money anyway. Meg closed the fridge door and went upstairs to sleep. For dinner, Meg cooked a meal of braised chicken and rice according to Amy's request. Meg also prepared a boneless braised chicken for Ugly Duckling. He poured chicken broth over the rice, and the little thing grabbed a small plate with its little paws and ate with relish. There seems to be a little bit left. Meg looked at the remaining braised chicken in the large pot. Because Ugly Duckling didn't eat much, there was still more than half of the braised chicken for 3 people left. There was also a little extra rice. Amy stood at the entrance of the kitchen and looked at Meg with a pleading expression as she asked, "Father, if there's any extra, can you put it on a plate for me? Amy has already eaten 2 bowls of rice. Even though it's delicious, you can't eat too much." Meg shook his head with a smile. She really was a greedy little kitten that wanted more. "Amy is already full, so I won't eat any more. However, if there's any extra, I want to give some to Jessica. She definitely hasn't eaten yet. She always saves her food for her mother." Amy shook her head with a conflicted expression as she said, "Charles and Derek definitely haven't eaten yet, either. If they see that I'm only giving some to Jessica, they'll definitely be sad, even though they're both very strong. My Amy is so kind." "All right, don't be conflicted. Count how many children there are in total, and I'll make 1 for each of them and 2 for Jessica. That way, they'll all be able to eat." Meg stroked Amy's hair with a smile before squatting down to look into her eyes, and earnestly said, "But only this once. We're not at the stage where we can help others just yet." Amy nodded obediently before giving Meg a kiss on the cheek, and a joyful smile appeared on her face as she said, "Millimeter, there are 20 children in total. Father, you're the best. Go play with Ugly Duckling for a while. It'll take a while before it's ready." Meg stroked Amy's hair with a smile before walking toward the fridge. He suddenly felt a pang of heartache. Even though he could use his own ingredients for the turkey, he couldn't afford to skimp on the cost of the other ingredients. The ingredients for 20 servings of braised chicken cost 6,000 copper coins. However, how could he refuse Amy's request? Meg wanted to protect the kindness in Amy's heart and protect her smile. However, he would only do this once. Even though he was making a lot of money every day, the exorbitant cost of purchasing strength points still made Meg feel a little pressured. Improving his own strength was the most pressing matter. As for doing good deeds, that was something that only those who had the energy to spare could do. He wasn't a saint who would sacrifice himself for others. In his heart, Amy was his #1 priority. Meg made 22 servings of braised chicken and rice in 2 batches. They were all packed in the lunchboxes provided by the system, and carefully placed into 2 large bags. "Let's go, Amy," Meg said with a smile as he held a bag in each hand. "Father, can you wait for me for a moment? I want to change my clothes," Amy said to Meg as she tugged on her beautiful purple dress. "All right, go ahead." Meg nodded with a smile. It seemed that she wanted to dress up to see her old friends. "Millimeter chem." Amy nodded before running up the stairs with her short legs. She soon came downstairs and changed her purple dress into a simple light yellow floral dress. "Are you going to wear this out today?" Meg asked as he looked at Amy with a hint of surprise. He had bought this dress because he thought it would be more convenient for her to wear at home. It was the simplest dress that she had. He had thought that Amy would wear the purple dress with the little flower on the chest. That was her favorite dress. "Millimeter chem. Jessica likes yellow dresses. She'll be very happy to see me wear it." Amy nodded with a serious expression. "All right, let's go then." Meg's heart softened. He hadn't seen such a pure and beautiful friendship in a long time. Meg carried the 2 large bags, and Amy carried Ugly Duckling in her arms. They locked the door and walked toward the Aden Square. After walking for about 10 minutes, they arrived at a long corridor not far away. A dozen or so children were sitting quietly on chairs, counting their earnings for the day. Chapter 258. It was a little girl in a grey linen dress. She was about 5 or 6 years old, and was half a head taller than Amy. The dress seemed to have been modified from an adult's dress, and there were many patches on it. Her hair had been casually cut to just below her ears, but her little face was very clean, and her bright black eyes seemed to be able to see the reflections of good and evil. The little girl's mouth was wide open, and her eyes were filled with elation as she looked at Amy. She flipped over the back of the bench and ran toward them. "Jessica!" Amy also yelled with elation as she also ran toward her on her short little legs. The little girl ran over with her arms wide open, but she suddenly stopped when she was 2 steps away from Amy. She withdrew her arms and looked at Amy's little dress with elation in her eyes. "Jessica, why aren't you hugging me?" Amy was a little displeased as she looked at Jessica. "Because Amy is wearing a beautiful dress today, and I don't want to dirty your dress." Jessica shook her head with a smile, revealing a missing front tooth. Her eyes were still fixed on Amy's dress, and she really was very happy. Her eyes then fell on Ugly Duckling in Amy's arms, and her eyes lit up with elation as she said, "And this kitten is also yellow. It's so cute." "It's not a kitten, it's Ugly Duckling. It's actually a duckling, and it hatched from a duck egg." Amy shook her head with an earnest expression. "Really? But it doesn't look like a duck at all." Jessica was a little conflicted as she looked at Ugly Duckling. However, she quickly turned to Amy with anticipation in her eyes, and asked, "Can I hug it?" "Meow." Ugly Duckling raised its little paw with an expression of refusal. "Of course." Amy nodded before turning to Ugly Duckling. "Ugly Duckling, this is my good friend Jessica. You have to be good, or you'll have to run 5 extra laps today." Meow tilde Ugly Duckling immediately gave in, and it rolled its eyes as it allowed Jessica to take it from it with a resigned expression. It's so adorable and awesome." Jessica caressed Ugly Duckling's kitten with elation. "Amy. Ari Xiaomi." The other children in the hallway also caught sight of Amy, and they all greeted her. Some of them even gathered around her with curious looks on their faces as they looked at Ugly Duckling in Jessica's arms. Meanwhile, Amy greeted them one by one with a happy expression on her little face. The little guy's popularity is pretty good, but it seems that the habit of giving people nicknames isn't a recent one. Meg couldn't help but smile. These children ranged in age from 4 or 5 to 8 or 9 years old. Their clothes were rather shabby, and they looked just like the first time he saw Amy. The little girl named Jessica looked very intelligent and sensible. She seemed to have the best relationship with Amy. Xiaomai said that you are all her good friends, so she asked Uncle to bring you delicious food. "You guys haven't had dinner yet, right? Then, can we have one each?" Mag said to the children with a smile. "Sure." All of the children's eyes immediately lit up as they stared at the 2 bags in Meg's hands. "Jessica, this is my father. He made super delicious braised chicken and rice for all of you," Amy whispered into Jessica's ear, "and he made a portion for your mother too." "Father. Father." Jessica looked up at Meg with a hint of envy in her bright eyes. However, a joyful smile quickly appeared on her face as she nodded at Amy, and said, "Thank you, Amy. I knew you were the best to me. Come over here and eat. Sit down on the chairs." Meg walked over to the hallway with the 2 large bags and gently placed them down. He then took out the braised chicken and rice from the bags one by one. Due to the fact that some of the children were too young, he arranged them in a row on the chairs and opened the lids. "It smells so good." Gulp. The alluring aroma of the braised chicken wafted through the hallway, and all of the children's eyes immediately lit up as they swallowed involuntarily. However, they were all rather hesitant at the sight of the delicious braised chicken, and none of them dared to step forward. "Eat up, children. This is your dinner." Meg opened the lid of the last braised chicken, and there were only 3 boxes left in the bag. There were only 19 children present. All of the children looked at one another, but none of them stepped forward. "If we miss out on this meal, we won't be able to eat such delicious food for a long time. Father's braised chicken is super delicious." Amy led Jessica over to a braised chicken and took Ugly Duckling from her with a smile on her face. It smells so good. Thank you, Amy's father. I'll have the first bite. Jessica's eyes lit up as she looked at Meg with a smile. She picked up a piece of chicken with her chopsticks and took a bite, upon which her eyes immediately lit up. What a wonderful taste. She didn't know what words she could use to describe this flavor. All she knew was that it was absolutely delicious. She had never tasted anything so delicious in her entire life. It's so delicious. Jessica swallowed the piece of chicken in her mouth and sniffed as she fought back the tears in her eyes. She then immediately put the remaining piece of chicken into her mouth. Don't cry, Jessica, are you all right? Amy hurriedly wiped away her tears with a concerned expression. I'm fine. It's so delicious that I'm crying. Jessica shook her head as she put another piece of chicken into her mouth. Tears streamed down her face as she chewed. Meg shook his head with a smile. This little girl was simply too adorable. However, this was the best compliment he could give to a chef, and a sense of pride welled up in his heart. All of the other children also couldn't help themselves at the sight of Jessica eating so happily. After a brief hesitation, they all made their way over to the braised chicken and began to dig in as well. It's so delicious. Amy, your father is the best. It's so delicious. War. I can't help myself either. All of the children's praises were intermingled with a few sobs, and the atmosphere was still very warm and joyful. Jessica, let me tell you a secret. If you pour this soup over the rice, the moon rice will taste even better, Amy whispered into Jessica's ear. There really is a moon in this rice. It's so good. Jessica's eyes lit up at the sight of the rice in the box, and all of the other children immediately exclaimed in amazement. It does seem like doing some good deeds from time to time will change one's mood. Meg stood off to the side, and a smile also appeared on his face as he looked at the smiles on the children's faces. If he didn't have the pressure to recover in the future, doing some good deeds would be a good choice. Chapter 259. The Morton Manor was located in the northwest corner of the wealthy district of Chaos City. It occupied a very large area, and the grey and white architectural style was very luxurious. However, the square architectural style and the single color of the building also made it look a little serious and rigid. The evening lights were lit, and the servants in the manor walked in and out with serious expressions. Their footsteps were silent, and they didn't communicate with each other at all. It was as if they were performing a pantomime. In a luxurious hall, there was a long mahogany table, and there were about a dozen people in luxurious clothes sitting around it. In front of each of them was a fried steak with caviar. However, everyone's hands were placed under the table, and no one said anything. The atmosphere was a little tense. The crystal chandelier above lit up the entire hall, and there were a few servants standing off to the side with serious expressions. Geoffrey sat at the head of the table, and his gaze swept past his wife, Denise Marquis, who was sitting beside him. His gaze paused on his second son, Cyril, who was sitting beside his wife with his head slightly lowered. He skipped over his daughter-in-law and landed on his eldest son, Lance, who was sitting a little further away with a straight posture. This eldest son of Chaos City was famous for his stubbornness, but even he didn't dare to look him in the eye. Geoffrey's brows furrowed slightly. He glanced at Jong's son Mickey, who was sitting next to him, and finally looked at the young girl wearing a veil. He said with a displeased expression, "If you're too embarrassed to take it off when you're eating, then don't sit at the table." The people of family Morton are never afraid of others' gazes. Everyone turned to look at the young girl sitting in the corner in unison. Big Sister Gloria is afraid that her stunning beauty will scare us. I haven't seen that beautiful big sister for many years. Heidi, who was sitting next to Cyril, pursed her lips with a hint of mockery in her voice. She was a young girl around 16 or 17 years old, and was quite pretty. Yes, I remember that big sister was very beautiful when she was young. Her twin sister, Hanai, who was sitting next to her, nodded in agreement. The two of them looked almost identical, and they were both staring at the young girl in the corner with an intense gaze. That's right. Sister-in-law said that she was born beautiful, and that she would definitely be one of the most beautiful women in Chaos City when she grows up. Why doesn't she even dare to see people now? Aurora, who was sitting in the middle, said with a smile. Her bright red lipstick made her face even paler. She was only 30 years old, but there were already many fine lines at the corners of her eyes. The young girl in the veil clearly stiffened, and her hands clenched into fists, but she still didn't say anything. Aurora, and Aurora of Auroras, and Aurora's Auroras, but she didn't dare to say anything. Father, Gloria has already grown accustomed to wearing a veil since she was young. This is her freedom, and I think you should respect her decision. Lance looked up at Geoffrey, and met his eyes without any intention of backing down. Freedom? A hint of mockery appeared on Geoffrey's face, and his expression abruptly darkened. He pressed his hands onto the table, and leaned forward slightly as he raised his voice. I gave you your so-called freedom, and then you went to become a poor teacher. You made me the biggest joke in Chaos City. Everyone is saying that I, Geoffrey, gave birth to a good son, and chose to teach a bunch of little kids instead of taking care of my family's assets. Now, you dare to talk to me about a little girl's freedom? Women are nothing but accessories to men in this world. If they can't be married off, then they're not even worth being an accessory. Cyril looked up at Aurora, and a smile appeared on his face. However, he quickly withdrew his gaze, and continued to look down with an obedient expression. Aurora, Hanai, and Hanai looked at Gloria with a gloating expression, as if they had nothing to do with the woman that Geoffrey was referring to. Teaching is a noble thing, and it's a career that I'm passionate about. This is my choice, and also my freedom. Lance abruptly rose to his feet, and looked at Geoffrey with an intense gaze. He then turned to Gloria, and raised his voice as he said, as for women, they're not anyone's subordinates. They have their own thoughts, and they're capable of doing the same things as men. This world is prejudiced against them, and we're supposed to correct this world's misconceptions. Gloria abruptly raised her head to look at the side of Lance's face, and her purple eyes lit up under her veil. Her father had given up his identity as the heir of the Morton family to become a common language teacher at Chaos School. Was this the real reason behind his father's decision? How arrogant. You think you can correct this world's misconceptions? Geoffrey retracted his hands, and leaned back in his chair. He looked at his eldest son, and a hint of disappointment flashed through his eyes. However, his smile became even more derisive as he said, if you weren't born in family Morton, you wouldn't even have the money to pay for your daughter's medical fees. What right do you have to correct this world? Father's health isn't very good, big brother. Don't make him angry, Cyril said to Lance with an earnest expression, and there was a hint of resignation in his voice. Lance clenched his fists, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything else. After a moment of impasse, he slumped back into his seat in a feeble manner. Indeed, if he hadn't been born in the Morton family, how would a normal teacher like him have the money to treat Gloria's illness? Gloria's hands were trembling slightly, and the fire in her heart was burning brighter and brighter. There was a kind of power that was trying to break free from her shackles. Mickey held onto Gloria's hand with a concerned expression, and shook his head gently. He was only 10 years old, and he didn't understand what the adults were saying. However, he knew that his grandpa was angry, and it was best that no one said anything at this time. Otherwise, they would be scolded. This world will never change. The Aiden Chamber of Commerce will always rule Chaos City's economy. The rich will always be the rich, and women will always be the vassals and vases. Geoffrey withdrew his gaze from Lance, and picked up the knife in front of him as he spoke in a low and confident voice. Everyone else heaved a sigh of relief, and also picked up the cutlery in front of them. Grandpa, I believe in Father's words. Women can also do what men can do. We don't have to be vases. We can do whatever we want. I won't be anyone's vassal. I want to be an independent and free person. Right at this moment, Gloria, who had been silent all this time, suddenly stood up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was very firm. Everyone's hands froze, and they were all in disbelief. They didn't think that Gloria, who was usually so obedient and quiet, would dare to refute Geoffrey's words. This was almost impossible in family Morton. Lance also turned to look at Gloria in surprise, as if he was meeting his own daughter for the first time. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.